Breaking news flashed across the screen. There had been an incident. A man in his 40s was arrested for kidnapping and imprisoning a child. Black police cars were parked outside the house, surrounded by an open field. The victim was confined in this rundown warehouse for a staggering 12 years. People were gathered on the lawn as they rushed in to attend to this issue. The police had successfully detained the suspect on charges of kidnapping, confinement, and labor law violations. This news was reported all over television as breaking news, and it was covered by many headlines. For the sake of privacy, the arrested suspect was allowed to wear a face mask as the police led him past the crowd that gathered to take pictures. The media was, of course, desperate to get a nice scoop on the news. They wanted to know if the perpetrator knew the victim personally before committing the crime. They also asked important questions like who was the first to report the crime, while the police dutifully tried to push them away from the door. The poor victim was showing signs of hearing and speech impairment. This made the authorized suspect that the perpetrator was aware of this beforehand when planning the crime. They'd been able to cut through the lock where the poor victim had been confined, and they opened the door of a dark room to see stacks and stacks of books. When they were rescued, they found that the warehouse had been flooded with countless books. And seated on that mountain of books was a youth who was still trying to read in that dark room. Law enforcement reached out to their captain immediately, informing them that they had indeed found the poor, haggard-looking victim. Based on the severe injuries on his body, it was presumed that the poor boy was subjected to long-term abuse. The victim, who was nicknamed A, was transported to the hospital and is currently reported to be in stable condition. Reporters were, of course, not allowed inside as they worked to stabilize the poor victim. Some of the media tried to protest and say that they were hurt, so they also needed medical treatment. Shin Woo-jin was 18 years old. They had finally confirmed the victim's name. The youth was suffering from intense malnutrition and multiple external infections. The bright-eyed, beautiful youth was adorable as he stared into the bright light for the first time in a long time. The doctors could not imagine how someone could hurt a beautiful child, which was a bizarre choice of words, because it's not like an ugly child deserved that either. The poor boy had been locked up and forced into labor for 12 years. The youth had also suffered from hearing loss as he had not been exposed to sound for a long time. The doctor sighed and took notes of this bizarre situation. She wrote down a question and showed it to the boy, asking if he could say his name out loud. The boy stared at this question, taking it in, and she encouraged him to try saying his name. The boy finally opened his mouth to speak, repeating words that he'd probably heard all of his life. He declared that he was, in fact, a bastard. That was a rather dark response and not at all what the doctor had been going for. Well, the sun continued to shine brightly in the sky, and a rather suspicious-looking individual was about. Oh. It was just a farmer working in the hot sun and protecting their face from blisters with a bat and a face covering. While this one person toiled, a lazy man sat and watched. This seemed to be the youth's memory, and he remembered being tossed dry rice with vegetables every once in a while. The boy would scarf down the food with his hands, desperately eating like an animal since he was treated as such. Every time they opened the door, the person who fed him would call him a bastard, saying that he ate so disgustingly. The poor child was always cold during the winter because a draft would drift in from the closed windows, and he would shiver in the cold. Sometimes, when the boy was so desperate, he would even grab a roach. Hopefully not to snack on, but it was quite likely that he was snacking on it. Back to the present, the doctors were horrified by the poor youth's words, and they were rather shocked, speechless, unsure what to say to such a declaration. They were sure this was the effect of brainwashing, and they'd also found countless scars on the poor kid's body. This child had definitely suffered a lot of abuse all this time. Those monsters who'd done this to him should surely all be sentenced to death, in her opinion. However, all in all, this situation was at least a relief. The medical results were not as bad as they had feared, but the boy seemed jolted by her honest smile and kind touch. He was safe now, so he could sleep as much as he wanted in a warm bed. The doctor tried her best to communicate that he was safe and that she would soon be back. The other doctor asked if he should take care of the kid, but the female doctor assured him that she could take care of the boy by herself. The doctor managed to step out of the hospital room and ran into a huge crowd of desperate reporters who were still trying to get a good news scoop and were drilling the doctor on all sorts of questions. They wanted to know the patient's condition, and if his family had been found. They also wanted to know the patient's name. They wanted to know if he had a disability and if he could communicate. They fired question after question rather relentlessly. It made the doctor quite irritated. So, she scolded them for trying to make someone else's tragedy into their entertainment. She then asked the police how these people even got into the building. They were causing such a nuisance, and all of their access passes should be checked. All these reporters would be reported for obstruction and trespassing. Well, that finally got rid of them. Things got a bit quiet after that, and the only sound was the drip in the hospital. The main character lay in bed, resting and recuperating. After a while, he opened one eye and stared out at the white room that held him. He stared at that big white fluorescent bulb, with a lot of ideas in his head. Stretching out his hand, the boy's mind was flooded with more and more ideas. Suddenly, he heard a sound, and the boy looked up. There was another patient in the room using their phone. It was an older gentleman, and he noticed the youth staring at him. He had already heard the story, and he knew the boy was kidnapped. The poor child had a rough life, and he felt sorry for him because he knew the child's life would be tough due to his extra disabilities. The boy stared silently at the old man for a while, but he could see the name and all the information about the other patient that was placed by the man's bed. He even knew the guy's height and weight. Just by looking at the man, he could tell that he was left-handed and constantly dehydrated because of his dry skin. The man was oblivious to this as he was busy having a lot of fun just using his phone. The man had no watch marks or rings, so he clearly worked a physical job and had no spouse. Putting all of these pieces together, the youth could detect that his roommate was probably doing some plastering work on a low rooftop and fell. As he fell, the left-handed brain instinctively directed his left foot to land first, but the femur couldn't withstand the force of the impact and shattered, protruding outwards. The main character could imagine the man's scream of pain like he'd been there to witness the accident. He could even guess the most appropriate first aid in that situation. However, his thoughts were interrupted when the female doctor returned. She had brought him some food and asked if he'd gotten some rest. She knew he must be hungry, and she'd brought a fork and spoon for him to use. Meanwhile, her patient was busy analyzing her. The boy thought that the doctor was a man, and he noticed the doctor's drooping eyes and crow's feet at the edges. The boy also noticed how their cheek muscles lifted upwards and noticed the symmetrical smile. It was a genuine smile and a sign that this man did not see him as a threat. The doctor handed him the spoon and encouraged him to eat as much as he wanted. No one would scold him. The boy was shocked by it and stared at more food than he'd ever been given in captivity. The boy gulped, and the doctor explained that it was hospital food, so it might not taste great, but she still encouraged him to eat a lot. Well, the boy gripped his cutlery and got busy. He scarfed down that food like it was the Hunger Games, abandoning the food at some point and just using his hands. The doctor and the other patient were in shock at how fast he was eating. The doctor had to tell him to slow down or he'd choke. However, the boy had no intention of slowing down, and he just kept chowing down. He ate those plates clean and even started picking up the little grains of rice. The doctor was horrified, wondering just how this poor child had been able to survive all this time. She got a call, and she picked up the phone to greet the caller. Apparently, the boy's family had arrived. It seemed they'd been able to locate the boy's relatives. The doctor excitedly told the youth that his mom and dad were here. The youth calculated her eager smile. He recognized the titles of mom and dad. The people who had come should be his family. The doctor happily told him that the doctor would bring them soon. The youth watched the doctor leave in awe, speechless as she left. Time passed in the silence, and he wondered how long it would take for his parents to reach him. He started counting the seconds and then the minutes. Suddenly, a voice said that it would make sure that the main character could hear them. The boy was confused as his senses became even clearer. His eyes widened as his brain activity intensified. He kept thinking, and he listened closely, watching the movement outside the door. His eyes widened as the people came closer. He could hear them now. He could hear the very step of the person's heel on the floor. That sound traveled all the way to his hospital bed. It was like a sound arrow speeding right to him. The boy's eyes widened as his hearing suddenly got so much better, and suddenly everything sounded so much louder. The patient's stability was their top priority. They needed to make sure that he was not startled. The boy was speechless as he listened, and then they were getting ready to come in. His eyes widened, and he stared at the people who came inside. A woman and a man. Their faces brightened with smiles when they saw him, calling him Woojin. They rushed to him, calling him their son, even though the doctor had told them not to startle the poor boy. The boy stared at the two people coming in close with their arms open for large hugs. It surprised the main character to be embraced by a loving mother and a joyous father. The woman was pretty, so she looked a little like him, and he had his father's hair. They both celebrated saving their beautiful child, crying their apologies for not keeping him safe. They were grateful that he was unharmed and thanked him for coming back. Their cries and love and adoration were loud, so loud in Woojin's ear that he finally got overstimulated and pulled away from them in pain. The boy covered his ears, staring at them in fear as they asked him what was wrong. They were concerned, asking if he was okay, but the noise they were making felt overwhelming, and the boy cried out. It was loud. The sobbing, the crying, the shouts of joy and relief at seeing their son. All of this noise was much too loud for the little boy, who had just regained his sense of hearing. The sky was bright and blue over a brown apartment complex, and it was a bright new day in a new scene. A lady was just wrapping up a phone conversation with her mother. Seated in her house, she admitted that she had cleaned it all up and then ended the call. After the call, the girl sat in silence and wonder. See, her big brother was finally coming home, and he was likely the poor, overstimulated main character we'd already been introduced to. The sweet little brunette was not sure how to feel about this development. After all, her brother had been gone for many years. She had not gotten to see much of him since he needed to rest, plus the way he talked and acted sounded a bit unusual. She'd gotten a glimpse of him at the hospital when his mother had fed him an apple, and honestly, he'd seemed so weird back then. She'd only been a baby when he'd been lost, so she had no childhood memories of her brother to reflect on either. She had seen pictures of where her brother had been forced to live. It was a warehouse, and she could not imagine being stuck in a place like that for 12 years. The smart brunette easily reasoned that she would also be weird if she'd been stuck in a place like that for 12 years. Fortunately, the boy had seemed to have regained his hearing. However, psychologically, her brother was still a little weird. Suddenly, the girl heard a noise that startled her. Her parents had arrived pretty fast, and they had also brought her brother home. This was a huge moment for the small family, and the young girl came over to welcome her brother home. The mother guessed that the young girl must be starving, so she would get started on dinner. The father also smiled and called for Woojin to come inside. The rescued boy stepped into his home for the first time in 12 years and met his little sister. The odd boy was a little tall and gangly as he was still trying to put on some weight, and he looked around this spacious home in awe. The girl nervously said hello, greeting her big brother. The boy was a little mystified and silently stared at the house, so there was an awkward silence. Then the boy looked around and saw pictures of the girl around the house. His father placed a gentle hand on his back, understanding that it would be awkward for the boy to be home after so long. They pointed him in the direction of his room, asking if he still remembered living there. The boy mumbled that he did, and they asked if he wanted to look around his room while spending some time with his little sister, Bomi. The young girl was surprised, but the parents encouraged the siblings to get closer and spend some time getting to know each other. The sister wanted to help prepare dinner instead, as she was still rather nervous around her brother. However, spending time with her brother was considered part of helping, so she couldn't say no. Without further ado, both siblings were pushed into the room to spend some time together. The girl tried to protest, but it was too late. Soon, the mother got busy preparing dinner, and she set the pot on the fire to make some delicious food for her two precious children. While all of that was happening, the siblings stood awkwardly in Woojin's room. The awkwardness was even worse than the girl's imagination, but she tried her best to endure. The boy stared at something in his room and at his neatly arranged bed. He recognized a bed, but he'd never had one before, as he'd been forced to live on top of books all of his life. He also recognized the window next to the bed. All of these were things he'd mostly read about in a book. He knew the private computer and the chair as well. Everything around him was a little strange, but it was his. This was his room. The girl nervously talked to her brother, and he turned his full attention to her. It caught her a little off guard as she stared into those big, soulful eyes that almost mirrored her own. The brunette ended up crying because her brother looked so much cuter in person than he did in the hospital. Now that he was cleaned up and getting his bearings, he didn't look so weird after all. The girl nervously called her Appa, deciding to teach him how to use a phone. Right now, the phone that she gave him was turned off. However, she could show him how to hold it to turn it on. The boy listened attentively to the teachings of his sister, practicing and learning. She taught him their parents' numbers as well as her own so that he would always be able to contact them. She deleted her number, so he encouraged him to try saving it. The boy was in awe and tried speaking again. Speaking was something he hadn't done a lot in captivity, so he was still adjusting to it. His sister had no idea what he'd just said, and she sat there looking very lost and confused. Then she realized that he was telling her that he understood her instruction. Bomi appreciated that, but Woojin did not need to use such formal language when talking to his little sister. The boy struggled to show his understanding, using the words he was more used to using with the people he'd lived with. Bomi fell silent as she realized this was something that might take a while. Deciding to move on to other topics, she asked him to try turning on the phone first. So, Woojin did as directed. The youth stared in awe as the phone began to load before him, producing bright colors and an interesting figure. Then she taught him how to make a new contact and save her number. He listened attentively to everything that she said. The little sister called out her number, and he got to work writing it down so that he could save it. She watched in awe as he picked up the instructions pretty fast, laser focused on doing exactly as she told him, and she was surprised that this was his first time using a phone. His fingers moved even faster than hers did when she used a phone. Woojin was just worried about whether or not he'd done it correctly and followed her instructions. The little sister encouraged him, telling him that he'd done quite well, and that he was very smart. It seemed her brother was the kind to pick things up so quickly. Now, she would teach him how to search for stuff on the internet. The boy was curious and confused, but he was ready to learn that too. So, she showed him how to do a search on the internet, showing him how he could type whatever he was curious about. Once he typed the magnifying glass, lots of interesting answers would pop up. The youth stared at the phone in awe. Just like last time, his sister let him try to search for himself. The brother was curious about many things, so as soon as he got the phone, his fingers started to move really fast as he typed what he was curious about. Apparently, the boy was curious about his family. Tapping on images, the boy saw various wonderful images of families loving and being there for each other. It was a series of soulful and beautiful pictures that he could not really relate to since he'd spent his whole life locked in a cage. He took note of the happy mothers and fathers in the picture. Then Woojin turned and recognized Bomi as his little sister. She was his family. Everyone in that house was his family. This was his homecoming, and the lady who smiled so happily and brightly at him was his family. The boy fell silent, looking up in surprise while his sister stared at him with a curious expression on her face. This scent, coming from his sister, he recognized as perfume. The origin of perfume dates back 5,000 years ago. It was first used in religious ceremonies as a medium for communication with the divine. They would burn fragrant wood back then. Today's perfumes were a blend of various aromatic compounds and solvents. They were also used to appeal to others or create a personal image. Just remembering all the knowledge was like being transported. Ask about that ancient time, and Woojin stared in awe. The brother pointed out now that he scented a really strong perfume, and this surprised his sister. The boy stood and followed this scent of perfume, and this alarmed Bomi, who asked where he was going. The brunette called out to the youth in surprise, and he seemed to pause. She had called him brother. However, Woojin could not be distracted from the really important situation, which was the sweet smell that came floating to him. This scene was indeed incredible, and the boy stared in awe at all the plates that had been set out. It wasn't perfume that had such a sweet smell after all. His deduction this time had been wrong. All of that delicious smell from the food left the youth in awe. His mother noticed him and happily invited the young boy to dinner, saying that he must be hungry. He was indeed hungry, and he sat to eat. The dad had even made the kimchi stew, and it was apparently so good that a person would not even notice if they died while eating the food. At this point, it sounded almost dangerous to eat the food, and Woojin wondered if he'd die while eating it. However, the statement was just a little joke from his father. His sister was invited to watch, and they all sat down like a family. There was food pushed on the boy's plate, and the parents encouraged him to try some of that nice food. The family stood around each other and chatted happily, feeding and welcoming home their new son, as they encouraged him to try all sorts of food. The rescued boy was struggling with his table manners, so a bit of food flew here and there when he spoke while eating. However, Woojin was having the time of his life around these three happy people. This beautiful picture of this family was filled with light and bright vibes. Suddenly, little splotches of darkness started to appear. These splotches quickly rose in a trickle and then a wave of darkness that consumed this happy moment. A threat lingered outside of this beautiful scene. Back at the police station, the detained kidnapper was told that 5 years ago, his family members started dying, one every year. The wicked man was then asked if he had anything to say about that. The first to die was his wife, the second was his mother. Both corpses fell to the floor. The sister-in-law died from consuming a poisonous plant, and the two others close to him also died. The suspect was stuck in the police holding facility. Speechless and haggard, the man swore that he was not responsible. However, the authorities could not believe it. It was much too odd that mysterious deaths kept occurring around him, and they were sure that he was responsible. How did everyone die, and only he survived? Still, the suspect insisted that he was not responsible for those deaths. The police were sure that he was just refusing to cooperate, so they called on the detective. There was always the possibility that the suspect being questioned was not the killer. The detective found that hard to believe, and asked what the suspect was talking about. The suspect slammed his hand on the table, accusing the person he'd fed and given shelter to. Yes, this lousy kidnapper was blaming his victim for killing all the people around him. The man was handcuffed, crazy, and deemed delusional by the authorities. The detective cursed at him, telling the suspect to watch his tone, and an assistant came in, trying to encourage everyone to relax. The suspect insisted that no one understood the kind of monster that boy really was. The very smart boy that they had kept locked up in the book room for 12 years had not just been idle. He had sat using the very low light from the window, and he'd read each book cover to cover. He flipped through each page, reading about autopsy and learning all about human anatomy in the darkness of that room. The suspect insisted that the victim was indeed being subjected to all of this pain and suffering, and lightning had flashed in the sky over the shed on one dark day. The day that the creepy little victim focused very closely on the book that he read. It was evening at the beautiful block where Woojin's family lived at. It was a rather peaceful evening, and light could still be seen in the window of Woojin's room. The youth was sitting at his table, still trying out all of the wonders that he could get from this new and fancy device that his sister had handed him. With a smile, she told him that a lot of people watched a video app. This app was red in color and filled with all sorts of skills and information. It was the first time that the little genius was gaining access to any form of video learning, and he was amazed. He watched an interview with a man with wonder. The man was out to watch a play. On instinct, the boy greeted the video and tried to say hello. Apparently, the video had been trending a lot. Taking hold of the video cursor, the boy pushed it back a bit so he could echo the words that were spoken by this very interesting gentleman. Slowly but surely, Woojin began to practice how to say hello. Very carefully, he sounded out the words to himself. Learning how to speak, he practiced because he wanted to properly greet his dear family. So, the youth practiced hard. Then, he stared in awe when he saw a fancy plate of tteokbokki mukbang. It looked so delicious. There were some ladies eating that on their tube channel because they had been craving it all week. The food was very good and chewy. It was also full of a lot of flavor. This was so amazing, and she gasped at the beautiful stretchy cheese. The man's mouth began to water as he stared at them eating, thinking it was rather amazing and delicious. There was a loud knock on the door, and the youth was startled. His little sister had come over that morning, and she wanted to know what he was doing and if she could come in. Sure enough, he invited her in, and Bomi greeted him with a smile. The boy asked if she needed help with something, and the girl was surprised. The boy was used to getting called when people wanted something from him, so he asked if his sister wanted him to do some cleaning or something like that. The sister was surprised and quickly dismissed that line of thought. He did not have to do all that. She had, in fact, come to call him to ask if he wanted to go out for ice cream. The boy was surprised and echoed the word. Ice cream was super cold and delicious. She loved it, but she also suspected that he had never had it before. The sister took his hand and pulled him out to meet his parents. Of course, the parents were rather concerned when they saw their children heading out, telling them not to stray far and to only go to the ice cream place. They did not want a repeat incident of their worst nightmares. Bomi was to hold her brother's hand tightly and to stay together with him. The girl laughed and assured her parents that they would be back soon, and her brother echoed her words. They then stepped out together to get some ice cream. It was evening, the sun had already started to set, and cars were a little busy on the main road. The name on the ice cream shop glowed brightly, and the siblings headed inside. The youth stared in awe at the bright name on the ice cream shop, truly in awe of such a beautiful and bright sign. Inside was even brighter and more colorful. It was Woojin's first time to see so much produce in one place. His sister called out to him to keep up with her so that he would not get lost. She encouraged him to pick whatever he wanted to eat. The boy was amazed to see so many flavors of ice cream. The sweet girl giggled at his confusion and asked if he wanted her to help out. So, they both stared at the fridge of ice cream for a hot minute as they tried to select the perfect flavor. Then, she grabbed one, saying that it was quite tasty. As the two walked to the counter, she wondered if she should let her big brother pay for the ice cream that they bought, since he was older and all. However, she decided that it was too early to rush his learning, and they would take it slow. So, she took the boy's ice cream and handed it to the cashier so that they could pay for it. With all of the ice cream paid for, the girl waved goodbye and told them all to have a nice and wonderful day. A bunch of school girls were eating ice cream outside and were quite surprised to see the pair. It was the worst. Those girls were eyeing the handsome brother. It was much too early for him to deal with the trials of girls just yet. His sister was cutely teaching him how to open the ice cream, unaware that there were a bunch of girls ogling the beautiful boy. They were quite excited and wanted to ask for his number. They even wondered if that was his girlfriend next to him. Mind you, Bomi could hear absolutely everything they were saying, and she felt rather smug about it too. Then, she told her brother to give his ice cream to her. She would open it for him. He much appreciated the assistance since he was struggling with the wrapper. The girl beamed and told him that he did not need to thank her, and she loved showing off in front of those other girls anyway. With the ice cream open, she handed it back to her brother, telling him to try it because it was super cold and sweet. Woojin took the ice cream in his hand and took a bite. He had been learning to eat things slowly, so he did not rush. Those dull eyes of his brightened in awe and wonder when he took just a bite of that ice cream. The boy could not believe what he had just tasted, and for a moment, he shook with awe. It was a whole new world of sweetness and treats opening right before him. He had never tasted something so splendid in his life. Bomi was worried that the treat had been too cold or that it tasted weird. If he did not like it, he did not have to force himself to eat it. However, the boy slowly said that it was tasty. This adorable little treat was so tasty. In fact, it was super tasty. The boy had never had anything like it, and he was in awe. His eyes watered with emotion, and he happily ate the ice cream with glee. The sister laughed, wondering when he had learnt that new word. Since it was so good, she advised her brother to eat slowly so that he would not choke. Then she had great fun calling him Appa in front of the girls, because they'd have no idea that they were biologically related. Her brother slowed down a bit, and she laughed with fondness to see him follow her instructions. Then, she suggested taking a picture of his first ice cream date, perhaps to further infuriate those leering girls. They took a bunch of pictures together, their cute, similar eyes being highlighted in a lot of them. So, they went on ahead, saying that they would eat while they walked. Later that evening, the sun kindly set over their sweet and gentle household. The two siblings were still walking back home with their ice cream treats in their hands. Bomi had sent the adorable ice cream picture to her friends, and they adored her brother, even begging her to switch with them so they could hang out with him. The girl was amused as she texted them back, walking home with her brother. Suddenly, Wooin started to get left behind, and Bomi did not notice because she was focused on her phone. She kept going, not aware that her brother was not following her. See, Woojin had noticed something. A suspicious-looking man was standing nearby, and this man was watching his sister. This strange-looking man was focused a bit too much on Bomi. His eyes zoomed in on her legs as she walked. He even dared to stare at her behind like a lecherous pervert. That awful stalking man was like a hyena in the wild, doing as he pleased and preying on those who were not aware of him. Naturally, Woojin could not let that kind of behavior slide. The man's hat had lots of marks, and he narrowed his brows in concentration. His eyelids were tightly pulled, and his pupils were dilated. On the way home, their family did not realize that the odd man had been following them. This meant that they did not know him, and he was an unwelcome presence. The man was not from around here, so he had come with a specific purpose in mind. Besides, that odd and very suspicious-looking man was going to great lengths to not be seen. The odd man made eye contact with the boy and realized with horror that he had been spotted. The boy still took notes of the man, noting that his armpits were soaked with sweat, and there were wrinkles on his pants' knees. There were also pedal marks on his shoes. The width of the pedal marks was narrower than that of a bicycle, so the man clearly drove a motorcycle. There was no dirt on the ground around here, which meant that he had come from the other side. Putting all this together, Woojin could tell that the man's job did not require strict time control. The man was in his late 40s as well, and he ran a delivery service using an old motorcycle. The family likely did not know him. He was not a local. He chose to cross small mountains instead of using roads with CCTV, and his actions are systematic yet chaotic. The man was left-handed and he lived alone. Compiling all this information, Woojin called out to his sister Bomi, who finally paused. She asked why he was standing still and if he had seen something, looking around for any hints of what he had seen. He couldn't explain it, but he told his sister to just head inside first. Bomi was quite surprised at her brother's request, and she looked around, still searching for a possible intruder. She felt almost sure that he would still be around somewhere. The girl once again asked her brother if he had seen something, but he still insisted that he wanted her to go inside first. Well, it was much too late at night to leave him outside by himself. Besides, if she went inside alone, their mother would surely scold her. After all, they had only just gotten back their son. No one wanted to lose him again. The brother did not even try to fight it after that argument, and he basically let himself be dragged back home while he munched on his ice cream. Their mother was waiting for them to come inside, so it was time to go back inside. The house was peaceful and quiet, and the light was on in Woojin's window. Suddenly, the street light beside the window went out, and the neighborhood looked a tad darker. Another street light burned bright and brilliant in the dark of the night, attracting moths to its brilliant burning heat. In that darkness that stretched a mile over the country, a clock ticked in the silence of a room. Woojin stood at his window, contemplating that darkness as he waited for sleep to fall over his neighborhood. This was his family. He had no intentions of sharing this wonderful and happy life that he had found with intruders. It seemed there was another voice in Woojin's head, a voice that asked if he was going to run up to the strange guy and yell at him, mocking and asking if that was how he planned to protect his family. There were many ways to protect his family. Besides, the dark voice was a monster that did not belong in this world. The dark voice insisted that he had done what he had done to survive. In the dark of that room, if the boy was as naive as the dark voice had been, he would have already been dead. Woojin insisted that he could have survived on his own. The darkness should never have been born into this world. It began to rain in the dark of the night, and Woojin stared out into the dark sky. The voice continued to mock him, annoyed at being called a monster. However, if the dark voice was a monster, then what did that make Woojin? Saying that Woojin was not better in anything than him. The dark voice took the shape of a monstrous form in the window. The boy replied that he had his body and he was the master of this body. The darkness was just another self that he had created in a moment of desperation. The darkness laughed, asking the boy if he thought he was the complete opposite of the darkness that lived in him. They both shared the same body, so the darkness had the right to call that vessel his own as well. Anxiety and fear were what this monster fed on. Whenever fear and anxiety crept in, this monster would take over him like he was possessed. However, now, Woojin could control the darkness. He could summon it from his subconscious, and he could maximize his knowledge. Now, he and the darkness could work in tune, almost one and the same. The fierce beast with sharp fangs that lived within him could still be tamed. Today, he called for the darkness to come forth. There was an ugly beast hunting his family, and he would not let that slide. Woojin's bright eyes dulled when the monster took over, cracking his neck and stretching as it took over his form. There were bright lights still on in the neighborhood outside. Even now, in the pouring rain, an unwelcome figure stood near their home. The creature smiled to see that their target had been so kind as to present himself before them. The boy turned towards his door. He was apparently going to leave through the front door, but there were a lot of problems with that. He very quietly opened the door to his home and stepped out in the quiet of the dark. Somehow, it seems he succeeded, and the rains kept pouring down from above. The neighborhood was covered in the light rain, which fell over every roof. As the rain came down, the monster came down to meet his target. The boy stepped out till he reached the last floor, and he turned to the strange figure that was standing in the rain. The man stood there, silent under his dark umbrella, wearing dark clothes even in the dark. The boy did not falter in his steps as he walked right up to the man, and the man tried to turn his face away, still avoiding conflict at this point in time, despite being a shameless stalker. That was embarrassing. Well, the boy walked past him, deciding to let the man let down his guard a bit. He caught some of the rain in his hand, admiring the gift from the universe. Even hiding one's presence was a skill. The man was well prepared, and he planned this exact day. The man was shocked to see the boys peeking at him, asking what he meant. The monster was not amused at all, complaining that the stalker was making this whole thing a bit boring. The man was speechless and alarmed, then he asked the kid who he was. The man's grip tightened on his umbrella. That was rather dangerous. The monster smiled, mocking the man's question. The lights went off on that corner of the neighborhood, and the creature laughed, saying that question hurt. The creature knew this man well. The man had jjajangmyeon for lunch after all. The man delivered food, and he crossed hills on his motorcycle. The man was shocked by this in-depth analysis, and the boy stepped closer. He knew that this person crept around their villa like a stray dog, and only his sleeves had cat fur on them. Then, the creature asked if the man had killed a stray cat as practice. This person sneaking around their neighborhood was a dangerous individual. The man's eyes widened in horror, shocked at all the accurate deductions, and he asked just what the creature was. The boy ran his fingers through his hair, and he smiled, his bright red eyes now looking deadly instead of cute. He could speak very well as the monster, and the intense rain continued to fall when the boy kicked the stalker in his stomach. The man crashed to the ground, falling with a groan of pain. The street light flickered back on, and the man's face was now exposed while the boy backed the security camera. The man was shocked, staring at his attacker in horror, and he gaped when the boy opened his shirt to reveal many scars. The boy's beautiful and porcelain skin was littered with dozens of healed lacerations, and the man's eyes widened in fear. The lights dimmed once again, and the creature warned the stalker, telling him not to show up in front of him a second time. If he saw this stalker again, then all of these beautiful scars would be carved into the man's body. The man backed away in horror under the rain. If the man understood, then he should stop lurking like a maggot and scram already. Well, the man did not need to be told twice. He jumped to his feet and ran. The rain continued to pour as the boy stood there, watching the man flee. He had been in such a hurry that he had not even taken his umbrella with him. Well, the boy left the evidence there and slowly made his way back home, walking slowly in the pouring rain. There was a bright light over the boy, and he smiled, taking in the beautiful shine of light over his beautiful face. It was nice to soak in the rain and get bathed in the warmth of the light after a successful defeat of his foes. The rain sure sounded rather nice. Darkness fell over the neighborhood once again, except that it was free from one stalker. From night there came morning and the slow and steady transition from darkness to light. The brilliant blue sky stretched out in the morning, and once again it was another bright day for Woojin to spend with his family. They went out for dinner together and had a blast just eating hot pot. The second day, He went out with his mum and they had the legendary tiak, kakochi on a stick. The boy was excited to try that too. On the third day, he went out to watch a movie with his sister, though the boy was busy being enthralled by the sweetness and wonder of the delicious popcorn. On the fourth day, the boy stayed home with his sister and did a bit of studying. Now that he had been rescued, he had to prepare to integrate with the rest of society. He was a bit off curriculum, but fortunately, he had done enough reading in that dark and awful room that getting back on track was not too difficult. Woojin was busy doing some basic science multiple choice questions to get into the flow of things. He read every question carefully and picked out the answers that he felt were most accurate. The boy's pen moved quickly, much to the shock of his little sister as he picked out each of the answers with amazing speed, barely even lingering to think or ponder if he was selecting the right answer. Bomi was amazed at how fast he was answering, and she gently reminded him that he had to read all the questions before answering, and he could not just guess them all. However, he gently assured her that he had read them all. The sister laughed, wondering where he even learnt to say that, and wondered if she had made a mistake in teaching him about YouTube. It looked like he had just guessed all the answers, but she should at least teach him how to check his answers to make sure that they were right. So, she sat by him and decided that they would check them together. So carefully, they checked each of the answers that he had selected for each question, checking to see if he had picked the right or the wrong answers. To the girl's absolute surprise, all the answers that her big brother had selected were in fact correct. He was outstandingly correct. Bomi asked if he had really read each question before answering, and he admitted that he had. Then he asked her if he had done well. Now the sister was amazed and she pulled out even more questions, asking him to try that too. The boy agreed and got to work. Just as quickly as he had filled in the last questions, his hand moved fast, and he answered all of these questions too. It was amazing for the young girl. Then, she took the questions he had answered and checked the results. To her amazement and awe, her brother was an absolute genius. The boy countered that he was not a genius, and that he just wanted to be normal, which was rather adorable, but a genius was a genius. The sister was surprised at his request to be normal, and he said that it was hard to be normal, but he still wanted to be. At Bomi's age, no, when she was even younger, she had lived a sweet life with her parents. However, her brother had been kidnapped. Her sweet brother had been beaten up by strange men, and he'd been forced to do all sorts of awful chores. The boy would shiver in the cold while surrounded by a mountain of books, struggling to stay warm. Her big brother had suffered a lot in his childhood, and her sister had tears in her eyes because she knew that it would have been tough. The boy noticed that her pupils had lowered, her eyebrow muscles lifted, and her eyelids were relaxed. The corners of her mouth had also drooped, and she was about to cry. The boy stood and gently patted his little sister's head, telling her not to be sad. Then, he went back to the table to scribble out a few things. She was curious about what he was doing, so he handed her a little something that he had written. The girl's eyes widened in awe, and she stared at the words that he had put down. Bomi noticed her brother was busy writing, and she asked what he was doing. The boy was writing very quickly because his sister was sad. As soon as he was done, he handed his note to his sister, and she gasped when she saw what he had written, her eyes wide with surprise. Her brother encouraged her not to be sad after all, a lower body temperature could weaken her immune system. Sadness could affect the tongue too, leading to weight gain and cardiovascular diseases. Sorrow was also the kind of thing that interacted with cortisol hormones, increasing stress levels and disrupting sleep quality. Since sadness activated the hippocampus, the brain required more energy, making a person feel tired. Sadness could also reduce serotonin levels, which could lead to depression and OCD. Her brother had proudly given to her all of these very specific warnings, and she turned to him in awe, asking how he knew all of this. The boy admitted that he read a lot of books. The girl acknowledged this with amazement. Soon, their parents called for them to come out to eat. Suddenly, her usually calm brother rushed outside just at the thought of food. It seemed Woojin loved their parents' cooking very much. Bomi was surprised and turned back to the note that her brother had given her. Her parents called for her to eat, and she acknowledged their request. It did not take long for evening to descend on the simple household once again, and Woojin happily went back to monitoring the YouTube channels. The boy favored the food channels and loved seeing all sorts of delicious foods. He bet that they all tasted amazing. He flipped from one video to another in awe, his eyes wide in wonder as he spent a lot of time learning on his phone. There were so many different types of food to try, and they all looked so unique and tasty. His favorite YouTube host was at it again, and she happily greeted her viewers with a smile. Today they were going to try out mala soup. She had already had dinner, so she would just have a small portion of the soup. To this lady, a small portion meant 10 servings of mala soup. She really loved to put things away. First, she would start with the wide glass noodles, and she scooped up these unique noodles with her chopsticks. Woojin watched attentively as this stranger ate. The host chewed on the noodles, trying them out. She had ordered the spiciest level, and it was indeed very spicy. She thought that it tasted great, and Woojin was now curious about what it tasted like. Then it was time to try the corn noodles. She picked up the much thinner noodles, gasping when a few heated pieces fell on her hand. However, she assured her viewers that the texture was incredible. Now, they would wrap it up in a cabbage, like wrap. Woojin's eyes widened in wonder as he paid attention to each of her instructions and listened closely to her direction. This host was a rather popular YouTuber, and she had many videos of her trying out all sorts of amazing foods. She scrolled through each one with wonder. The next video had the lady eating ramen, and she was going to boil it from scratch. He watched in awe as she boiled the ramen on a hot stove, his eyes full of this lady's face because he'd watched her so much. Then, she had to prepare before eating, of course, and let her hair down. It was a huge pot of ramen, and she was ready to eat. That girl could really put away. The boy watched her in wonder, and he scrolled past that video too after watching it to completion. The host happily dug into the completed pot of ramen with chicken, and Woojin watched as she complimented the meat. He wondered if acting like this would make him be considered normal. Watching how this girl smiled and ate on screen, he wondered if he could do that too. His father had once asked what he wanted to be in the future. Though his mother had been surprised at the question, it was fine if the boy did not have an answer. As long as he stayed healthy and happy, that was all that mattered to his mother. However, the boy did have desires. He wanted to be a normal person, or at least whatever passed for a normal person, a normal office worker. That was a great choice, and his parents encouraged him to be anything that he wanted. Of course, Woojin's greatest desire was normalcy. The next day, the sun shone brightly over the little neighborhood, with a bit more focus on a huge parking lot around the area. Woojin was there, of course, striding with confidence towards the building that had the parking lot. The boy desired to be a normal person, and he walked to achieve his dreams. He wanted to perform a rather normal action. The main character had decided that reporting someone seemed to be a normal thing to do, so that is what he was going to do. The youth walked into the police office, overhearing an interrogation going on, and someone denying their guilt. A police officer insisted that all of the evidence was caught on CCTV, so he was sure that the suspect before him was the culprit. Even with this evidence, the suspect dared to deny his guilt. The man across the table was bewildered, and he insisted that it wasn't him. He did not even wear hats like that. The police officer grunted in annoyance that the suspect would not admit it till the end, even though they had a witness. The man was shocked and asked who exactly had seen him when he had not even been there. There was no way that someone had seen him. Suddenly, the youth appeared in the room and called out to greet the detective. The detective looked up, rather surprised to see a boy standing in the middle of his office. The boy then repeated his greeting, being a bit more specific and calling out Detective Kim Tae-yeon. Now the detective recognized him and stared at him in shock and awe. A lot of the police force had already heard the news of the boy who had been kidnapped and rescued, so the detective recognized Woojin right away. The boy had grown so much in speech that the detective had barely recognized him. He even asked the boy if he had been doing well. The boy looked so different from the haggard teenager that they had rescued from that abandoned shed. The poor child had been carefully escorted into the police van back then, the detective gently telling him to watch his head. After shoving the poor boy into the car, the detective then strapped the shivering boy in the car with a seat belt, telling him that it was okay. Placing a hand on his shoulder, he assured Woojin that he would take him home safely. The boy had been speechless at this rescue, but he had never forgotten the favor that the detective had done for him. He thanked the detective, saying that he had indeed been doing well. The man smiled and acknowledged his health, and was even impressed that the rescued youth spoke so well now. Then, the detective called for one of his colleagues to take the suspect that he was questioning to the holding cell. The man grabbed the suspect and hauled him away, though the poor dude kept insisting that he was not guilty and that he had not committed the crime. The police did not want to hear it, though. The detective sighed as the dude was hauled away, and Woojin was curious as to what that person was being accused of doing. The detective was surprised and confused, but the main character explained that criminals always denied their actions at first. The detective laughed and said that most of the criminals they got around here always said the same thing once they got caught. It was like they were all following the same script, and it was all rather amusing to him. Then, the detective asked how the boy had found him, and if he had missed him and come looking for him. The boy admitted that he had something to show the detective, and the man immediately got serious. He wondered what the youth had to show him and asked if the boy wanted a drink they could get a drink, and continue this conversation away from prying ears. However, the boy was good, and he pulled out his phone with the YouTube channels, telling the detective to take a look. The man was surprised to see a video about mukbang, and he asked what the problem was. The man asked who was in the video and if the youth had somehow started a YouTube channel. Of course, it was just Woojin's favorite YouTuber who was doing food content as usual, and she waved and greeted her followers as usual. The beautiful girl waved, and Woojin explained that watching her videos just reminded him of himself. First of all, her eyes would often shift to the upper right when she was making her videos, which meant that she was lying. At the same time, her fingers moved to her lips to show nervousness. Bringing her hand to her mouth, while lying was often a subconscious act of wanting to take back the lie. She even slightly bit her lips sometimes during the videos, and this typically happened when someone was anxious or nervous. Feeling nervous in front of food, that's a bit off after all. Of course, all this time, the lady could just be worried about how the food tastes, but there was something that Woojin just could not ignore. Her eyes would once again shift to the right during the course of the video. She would say that the food was delicious, but her eyes told a different story. Her words and her actions did not match at all. While she ate, she would shrink her shoulders, and people tended to hunch when they felt threatened or uncomfortable. This was the limbic system at work, triggering a natural self-defense reaction. It was a form of self-protection. Now, her eyes would move to the upper left while eating. This was not lying or imagining. This time, she was recalling a memory, but unconsciously covering her mouth, which meant that she was hiding something. Covering the mouth subconsciously often signified the intent to conceal something, whether voluntary or forced. Then, he noticed how this host would touch her necklace while boiling the water. This was either stress relief or a subconscious action to regain psychological stability. The detective was speechless at this analysis, shocked at hearing a boy he'd rescued quite recently not only speak so fluently, but also make all of these quick deductions. Woojin explained that his favorite YouTuber seemed to be asking for help. He'd watched her videos enough times to figure that out, and he noticed the small S that she put on the table. She had left other noticeable signs in the corners of the video. An S, an O, and yet another S. If one put all of that together, all of those micro-expressions and unconscious behaviors, it was too much of a coincidence to ignore. That was why he had come now to report it. In other words, Woojin strongly believed that this host was being held captive somewhere, just like he had been. He had compiled all of the evidence from each of the videos that he had watched and was now sure beyond a reasonable doubt that this lady needed help. This lady had even signed various letters in each of her videos. Letters that he had caught, letters that were very discreetly in each image that passed. However, all of this still bewildered the detective, and he did not truly believe that this girl was captive. Still, Woojin was not deterred and went on to prove it. At first, she had given subtle hints through her hair, then through her hair tie. Now, it was through the background. She was showing more courage each time she managed to post a video. The detective then asked the boy to speak in clear terms about what exactly he was saying. The victim was likely in their early 20s, and the YouTuber likely had no family or grew up in a troubled environment. The perpetrators were not just one person either, but multiple. They were likely between their teenage years and early 20s as well. The ringleader of the gang that held the poor girl captive was quite likely in his 20s. The girl also likely did not graduate from middle school. The detective was still busy being slow, saying that he did not understand. Even if it was a fat chance, it was a possibility worth investigating. The detective could not believe that a young girl was kidnapped and being forced to make YouTube channels. The boy admitted that he did not know the perpetrators. After all, he was locked up for a really long time too. He had spent days, weeks, and years slaving away in the cold without proper food or a proper bed. That was why he was working hard now to save someone else from a terrible fate. That was why he could recognize the behavior of someone who was being confined. The boy then asked the detective if he thought coincidences could reveal the truth. The detective was still heavy in his disbelief era, so he still was not buying it. So, Woojin decided to bring his deductions a little closer to home. The boy could guess that the outfit the detective wore had been bought by his mother. After all, his own mother had bought all of the clothes that he was wearing, too. The detective was surprised at this accurate deduction, so the boy explained that this was just the first coincidence. Just now, the suspect may not be a professional, but he was likely passionate about playing the violin or the viola as a hobby. Woojin could tell this, and the detective was surprised to hear that the culprit could possibly play an instrument as a hobby. If the boy was right, then that would be the second coincidence, and he could keep going. The detective laughed and asked the youth if he wanted to be a profiler or something like that, but the youth shook his head. In truth, Woojin just wanted to be an ordinary officer working, and right now, he was just here to report something that he had noticed. That is why the youth was now explaining things to persuade the detective. To confirm the legitimacy of Woojin's detection skills, he asked the detective to ask the suspect in the holding cell about their hobby. After asking if he was wrong, then they could charge him with obstruction of justice, and he would take full responsibility. The detective groaned and laughed at the thought of accusing the youth of obstruction of justice. After all, Woojin was just sharing his theory, that was all. The detective did not see that as such a big deal. They went way back, so he could at least just ask about the suspect's hobby. The detective told the youth to wait a moment, and he would just go over and ask. So, the man stepped forward and went to ask. The detective strolled over to the holding cell, and he could not help but smirk in amusement at his actions. He was over here letting a recent rescue play detective because of a set of odd coincidences. Still, the kid sure spoke much better now, and he claimed to know how confined people act. The detective then paused as he recalled the odd deduction on who had bought his shirt, wondering how the boy had even guessed that. Well, the detective would not linger on that, and he got to the holding cell, calling the attention of the suspect. Just for the sake of it, he asked the man behind bars if he played the violin or the viola. The man was confused, but he explained that he did do that as a hobby. That was two coincidences. And the detective's eyes widened in shock. The chances of a punk like that playing an instrument were slim, but the e-boy had guessed it in one glance. The man behind bars angrily accused the detective of investigating him thoroughly and even searching his house. However, the detective was speechless, wondering if Woojin was somehow psychic. He had just been casually interrogating the suspect when the boy had come in that afternoon. The boy had not even once spoken to the suspect, and the detective had been surprised to see the boy come into the room. However, Woojin had only needed one glance to draw his conclusion. The suspect had a light mark on his face that indicated headgear, a turtleneck, or a violin. It was also likely that the suspect wore a motorcycle helmet, with a mask and shaving cream. He also had string marks on his fingers, so he could be a fisherman, electrician, jeweler, guitarist, tailor, or violinist. Pulling all of his deductions together, the most likely answer was surely a violin and a violinist. Thus, the youth had made his conclusion that the mark on his chin was from the violin, and the string marks went well with that theory. The detective returned to where the youth was waiting, but Woojin had already left. His colleague had no idea where he had gone either. However, the detective did find a sticky note on the table, and he went to investigate it. It had, of course, been left by the youth, and it pointed out the second coincidence. This meant that the third coincidence was worth investigating, and he hoped that the detective would consider looking into the high school mukbang girl who was desperately asking for help. It was a bizarre array of events and coincidences, but at this point, the detective could not overlook it. He called to his colleague, telling the man to search for the high school mukbang YouTube channel immediately. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood moved on rather peacefully. A bus drove up to a certain bus stop, and the people waiting there prepared to go in. Woojin was at that bus stop as well, and he got his transit card ready, just like his mother taught him. This was the second time, and the boy paid for his bus ride with his card. Carefully, the boy got into the back seat, and he sat there, looking out at the window. He could still remember the toasting of glass. The boy had sat eating meat while his father and another man made a toast. The man smiled and noted that Woojin wanted to be a simple office worker. The boy admitted that he indeed wanted to be a normal office worker, like at the company where he worked. The man laughed because he did not exactly work at an ordinary company. Still, his father's friend had heard that the boy was great at studying and that he solved problems in seconds. That was wonderful to hear. That meant that his office might be the right place for him. The boy was curious and asked if he could take a tour of this normal office building. If his nephew wanted to see it, then he should. So, his uncle invited him to his office. The day he promised to visit was that day, so Woojin noted that he would be at the office in 4 stops. Each one would take about 6 minutes, 10 minutes, 7 minutes, 9 minutes, and it would be a total of 32 minutes to get to where he was going. The office building was located in a giant, tall skyscraper. The boy called out to his uncle that he had arrived. The man on the other side of the phone said that he would be down in a second, and Woojin stared in awe at the giant building ahead of him. He had finally arrived at the Manhwa General Trading Building. It was a true large conglomerate, with many normal office workers going in and out. The boy stared in awe at all the people who walked past him, and he saw all the normalcy around him. It was his dream to live normally, just like these people. Then, his uncle called to him, greeting him as he finally found his nephew. He called the boy to come inside, as he should wait in the lobby instead of outside the building. The main character was grateful for being allowed to visit, but his uncle said it was nothing and was happy to give him a tour. So, they both headed inside. The lobby within was as large as one would expect for a company located in that giant building. It was rather fascinating, and the boy was impressed by the construction. There was a cafeteria in the basement, and this was the Manhwa's headquarters. They would also have branches across the country. Gwangju, Pyeongtaek, Daejeon, and Busan all had branches there. His uncle was impressed that he had looked that up already, and the boy admitted that he had. To live a normal life, he realized that he needed to know a lot. That was why he thought that being normal was harder than it seemed. The man laughed and acknowledged that the boy was really smart, saying that they should head up the stairs. The boy watched his uncle check into the building with his card, and they headed inside using the elevators. As they were heading up, the department head's son was suddenly spotted. The two turned and noticed a beautiful young lady. However, the man corrected that Woojin was not his son but his nephew. The man just needed to deliver something. The lady smiled with amusement, and Woojin stared at her, probably noticing a bunch of things right away. They were both surprised to see a high school student in the office building. The lady was surprised and asked what the boy was saying. Obviously, from the uniform, she was a high school student. The elevator was here now, and they could not spend any more time chatting about stuff. So, the man shoved his nephew inside and said goodbye to the girl. He waved and told her to enjoy her lunch as the elevator doors began to close, and he sighed in relief when they could not see her again. They headed to the 7th floor, and the man happily ushered his nephew inside. The boy stared in surprise and shock, amazed as he looked at the normal office that he dreamed of living in. There were people speaking all sorts of languages up there, and it was so interesting. People all over the office were engaged in completing all sorts of different tasks. There were some people sending emails, and others were canceling orders. His uncle called out, asking Woojin how it felt to be in an office building and if he felt like a real office worker sitting among them. The boy admitted that he did not. However, he would work really hard to become a good office worker. Then, the manager got word that the Saudi contract was cancelled, and the man was horrified, saying that he had asked for a meeting to be scheduled first. He called for everyone to immediately come to the conference room. The uncle had wanted to eat with his nephew at the cafeteria, but something urgent just came up. The boy said that it was all right and he had seen a lot after all. For now, he would go down by himself. So, the boy headed to the 1st floor, and he stepped out of the elevator, unfortunately running into that girl again. She noticed him first, and then she grinned and greeted him. He was silent as he watched her. It was currently 11 in the morning, and a high schooler should not be here at that time. She also did not seem the type who was intimidated by adults. She was a high school student with a calm tone and relaxed expression. She walked in long strides and asked if he had received what the department head had sent him. She walked confidently, blocked his way, controlled the space like it was her domain, and based on her actions, she was likely related to a high-ranking company executive. If she were related to a high-ranking executive, it would not hurt to know who. So, Woojin said that he understood and then said goodbye. With that, he walked away from her without looking back, shocking the arrogant and pompous princess. She yelled and said that he should be in class right now, demanding to know if he was skipping. Honestly, he could ask her the same question, but he did not go to school in the first place. With that, he was leaving once again, and he turned around to walk away. Of course, she did not like being interrupted, but he did not like wasting time. He saw no benefit in talking to her, so he wanted her to kindly stop bothering him. The girl was shocked, but he knew that when a person dismissed people like that, they would feel the need to prove their worth. Now, he wanted to know who she had connections with. Thus, the girl declared that she was the CEO's daughter. Woojin had now successfully tricked the young lady into revealing who she was by pretending that he felt like he was wasting time with her. Also, saying that he thought that he had nothing to gain. Naturally, this motivated the pompous peacock girl to then reveal her true nature as the CEO's daughter. Now that was an impressive figure, and it was just as the youth had expected. At times like this, it was always best to open his eyes slightly wider and part his lips just enough to look rather surprised by this. The girl was now thrilled, believing that she had caught him off guard, and she smirked haughtily, asking him if she looked different now. The girl stalked around him, taking note of his shoes and his clothes. She seemed to be doing some kind of assessment, not that the main character appreciated it. After revealing her identity, the girl was now shamelessly inspecting him as if he were someone beneath her. She had quickly regained control of her emotions and once again asked about school. Since he did not go, she beamed and told him that she was bored, wanting him to hang out with her. Her dilated pupils shifted slightly upward to the right, and the corners of her eyes drooped slightly as well. Her lips curled up like a sneer. This was the picture of greed. Having identified her position, the girl now saw the main character as no more than a toy for her to play with. However, what she did not know was that he was playing her like a fiddle. He could use that greed of hers to control her like a marionette. She hadn't eaten yet, so she asked if he'd go with her to get something to eat. It was framed like it was a choice, but Woojin knew better. He accepted anyway, easily marking the girl as a possible narcissist. He did not really want to deal with her, but she was not entirely impossible. Of course, the CEO's daughter took the lead right away and chose where they would eat. She didn't even give basic location details before leading the way. The world evolved around her. The restaurant of choice was rather large and already populated with a few people here and there. The girl then turned her attention back to the main character, asking if he was studying to be an idol since he wasn't going to school. However, the boy denied that. So, she asked what he did then. The boy explained that he studied and he was preparing for the GD, likely a special exam. Then he asked about her and asked why she was not at school. The girl flipped her hair, mumbling about how she got leave because of that day. Her pupils shifted left, which meant that she could be lying about that. She brushed her hair back, an unconscious reaction to stress. People experienced unconscious stress when they lied, so that was a possibility. Naturally, Woojin was curious about what she meant by that day. Suddenly, it clicked, and he realized it was the monthly shedding of the uterine lining in response to hormonal changes. Indeed, the poor, horrified girl was on her period, and the waiter came over to ask what they would like to order. The CEO's daughter was thrown off by his very casual response. Her face turned red before she ordered 2 course meals. Once again, she had not even slightly considered that he might want to choose his own meal. She had a strong desire to dominate others. The CEO's daughter only just remembered to ask his name, and he admitted that he was Woojin Shin. She then proceeded to analyze his name, saying that it was not bad. At any rate, she was Lee Hiram. Hiram took up her phone, and they sat there in silence for a bit. As time passed, the silence started getting rather awkward for her, and she stared, wondering why her entertainment for the day said very little. The boy admitted that he just did not talk much. The waiter came over with the soup just as Hiram waved her hand and knocked into the poor server. It nearly spilt the soup over, and the rich girl let out a screech like she was the victim. The waiter hastily apologized, she did not mean to startle them, and the rich girl huffed in annoyance. Hiram said it was fine, letting the waiter apologize on and on. Woojin watched the sullen waiter walking away and noticed that she was a rather sensitive lady. Besides, nothing much actually happened, so Hiram had not needed to make such a huge fuss about it. Naturally, Hiram huffed and said that day just made her a little testy. She was bringing that day up again. And Woojin found himself wondering once again if the girl was just lying. Her rubber band fell when she tried to fix her hair, and the girl sulked internally that this was just not her lucky day. She reached out to get it and was surprised when he put his hand by the edge of the table so that she would not hit her head. Of course, the rich girl was somehow oblivious to this and could not understand what he was doing. That was cool, though since he explained it to her, she eyed him suspiciously, and he stared back blankly. She must have had a rough day after all, and the girl protested, saying that he was acting like he knew everything. Well, he did not know everything, but Woojin was rather good at reading people. Her face looked a little tired. Hiram huffed, telling the boy to worry about himself instead. His face was so pale that he was practically see-through. Then, she told him to try out the soup before it got cold. He was pale because he'd been imprisoned for 12 years, but he did not feel the need to mention that. Instead, he took a sip of the soup and was immediately hit with wonder. Something that would always wow the young genius was definitely the rich joys of food. No matter how many times he ate, trying new food would never get old. The CEO's daughter beamed with pride, asking if the soup tasted good and if the soup was definitely on par with the top Busan K restaurant. The lady was much like a fish taking the bait. He got her in his trap effortlessly. If he backtracked from there, repeating the other person's words would help to build rapport. So, he asked about the K restaurant and who she had gone with. The lady beamed that she had gone with an old friend called Kim Yena. Naturally, he had never heard of her. The girl protested that the actress Im Yena was very popular, and the main character went with his approach of repeating her words, just saying that he had never heard of her. This annoyed the CEO's daughter, who then asked if he even watched movies or YouTube. This was regression therapy, reviving past memories through questions to evoke happy emotions. So, he said that it must have been nice to see the ocean. The girl beamed and she added that she'd also loved the fireworks bursting over Gwegendageo Bridge. It had been like a painting of pure art. Her body and brain, reminiscing about the past, were then flooded with dopamine and norepinephrine. In that moment, it felt like she was in a movie. The human brain could not distinguish between reality and imagination, like how just thinking of a lemon would make a person's mouth water. That was the state that the CEO's daughter was currently in. She was lost in that wonderful moment when she had seen the fireworks. Though she was sitting with him, she spoke as if she was watching fireworks on a yacht. Just by leading her memories and listening, he could become a source of her joy. In this state, he could even ask her about the heart-shaped fireworks, and she would laugh gleefully about it. He listened intently, and she insisted that it had been hilarious. He pushed the memory further, though, guessing that it was literally a heart-shaped firework. Their main dish was prepared and ready. What a sorry plate of food it was, but the main character made a show of enjoying this high-quality food so much. Then, she asked if he had traveled anywhere, and he admitted that he'd never engaged in travel. The last course was mango sorbet, and she insisted that he should definitely go. Last year, they went to an island called the Holbox. The boy continued to mention random words to trigger more nostalgia from her, like Mexico, the state of Quintana Roo on the Yucatan Peninsula. She smiled and praised the beaches of that state, and said that the night sky was packed with stars. It was almost like an aurora. She also recalled the beautiful shimmering waves. Suddenly, her eyes widened when she noticed the boy stand to his feet, saying that he needed to study. The girl was surprised that he needed to go all of a sudden when they were just having fun. Then she asked if he was doing some kind of shady stuff. Obviously, he would not admit even if he was doing shady stuff. At any rate, he had to study for the GD, so he bid her farewell and went on his way, much to her chagrin. She told him to wait, and he did wait, much to her surprise. Hiram could not believe that he wanted to leave like that, and she even asked him for his number. He had not even been to Holbox Island like she had, and it would be helpful to have her knowledge when he eventually traveled. She knew all about hotels and stuff, and she even knew all the best restaurants. The lady was addicted to the hormones that brought her joy, and she related those hormones to her experience with him. Thus, she was desperate not to lose him. The girl might have attachment issues and lack strong family bonds. If he used this properly, then everything she knew could easily become his. He stretched out his phone to her, having manipulated her into asking for his number instead of the other way around. Hiram was surprised that he did not even have a phone password. That was dangerous after all. He thanked her for the meal, and then he headed out. Hiram watched him leave in awe, nervously playing around with her hair. She then followed him outside, thinking that they should at least walk together since they had come together. She asked him where he lived, and the boy did not respond. Instead, Woojin was focused on a tussle that seemed to be happening some distance away. It looked like two grown men fighting, and the CEO's daughter asked what he was doing. Immediately, the boy shielded her gaze, telling her not to look. This was a rather serious situation, and someone had just gotten stabbed in an alley. The girl panicked, of course, horrified to hear that there was someone armed with a knife nearby. Someone willing to commit crimes with that dangerous tool. The villain with a knife took off on a run once he realized that he had been spotted, and the boy stared at him, taking in details of everything that he knew about the attacker. Then, the boy raced ahead, heading straight for the abandoned victim. Living a normal life was all that Woojin wanted. He pressed his hand hard down on the wound, administering quick first aid to stop the loss of blood. He told the victim to hold on a little longer while he called the authorities. Someone had been stabbed. He asked for the police to come in, too, and sent the location of the restaurant. The man's pulse was rapidly increasing, which meant that the cerebellum was working to increase the heart rate due to blood loss. The boy asked what the man's blood type was. The internal bleeding was rather severe. The victim managed to mumble that he had a type B, and the boy narrated that over the phone. A stab wound to the abdomen. There was severe hemiperitoneum, which meant internal abdominal bleeding, and the man needed an urgent transfusion. The people on the phone asked for a repeat, and the main character paused. Using layman's terms, he explained that the victim had lost a lot of blood and they needed a transfusion while being transported. His blood type was B and he had been stabbed in the abdomen. They needed immediate aid. They tried to tell him first aid, but he was already doing it, and he needed help to get there quickly. The people on the phone assured him that they were preparing the blood. Once again, Woojin thought about his desire to live a normal life as the man's blood pooled around his fingers. The CEO's daughter had come forward, even though he had told her to stay away. She stared in horror at the victim in front of her, her hands trembling as she stared at the very gruesome scene. The boy did not have the time to comfort her as he was trying to save the man's life. He could not help but think that living a normal life was indeed very hard. Fortunately, it did not take too long for the police to get there, and siren wails could be heard all through the neighborhood. The ambulance was there, and the police were there. It was fair to assume that the victim was being taken care of, so our dude carefully wiped down his blood-stained hands. Then an officer came over to ask him a few questions. Woojin already had all of the answers ready. He fired off that the suspect had short hair and was wearing a gray cap. The man was wearing a black-collared t-shirt, he had jeans on, and weighed about 80 kilograms. He was about 180 centimeters tall, and he was about to drop some info on the man's shoes when the police officer told him to slow down. The officer turned on his voice recording and asked the boy to just cover that description from the top. So, the boy did as needed, and the CEO's daughter watched from a distance, clearly rattled by all that she had seen so far. This must be her first time experiencing something like this. Naturally, most people did not get involved in violent crimes, but our dude had been raised in hell, so he was kind of used to it. The girl had been rather frightened just seeing the man with a knife, and it seemed that the nightmare was going to haunt her for a while. For him, her state of mind right now was also a perfect environment for him to continue his game of manipulation. Woojin strutted up to her like a mother heading to a baby that was taking her first steps. When faced with a shocking situation, it was normal for a person to either stumble or fall because they were unsure of what to do. Usually, a baby who fell was nursed by nurses and other caretakers to encourage them to try again. Like a parent, he could immediately comfort Lee Hiram and restore her confidence in herself. Right now, at this moment, there was no one else to take his place. He noticed that the lady was rather shocked, but it was okay now. This moment would leave a strong impression on her, which would further make her think of him. Gently, he placed his hand on her shoulder, soothing her and telling her that the victim was fine and did not seem to be seriously injured. It was like a mother comforting their baby. The culprit did not even see their faces, so they would likely be caught, and there were a lot of CCTV cameras around. The girl was reassured by these words. Later, in the evening, inside a nice and big house and deeper inside that led to a nice and big room, someone was taking a shower. It was Hiram, of course, and she washed away the weight of the day's stress under the warmth of the shower. The rich girl could still vividly remember how Woojin had rushed in and taken charge when that man got hurt. He had protected her and then reassured her that after that, everything was going to be okay. The lady smiled under the shower, her mind filled with memories of that boy, just as he had wanted. Later, she turned off the shower and stepped out, toweling her hair dry as she got ready for bed. Her slippers stepped on the luxurious rugs in her room, and she sat before her vanity table to prepare her face and hair for bed. The lady then glanced at her phone and recalled that she had, in fact, never gotten a chance to ask. Meanwhile, back at Woojin's side of the neighborhood, the window of his bedroom showed that the lights were off. The main character was in bed and watching his favorite YouTube video as always. He was still rather invested in that strange kidnapped girl. She insisted that the food that she made was seriously delicious, saying it enough times that it was almost concerning. Woojin admired the food in the video, promising to himself that he would definitely try out that food someday. Then, he got a message from Hiram asking if he had gotten home safely. The boy stared at the phone for a moment and then typed out his response. He sent his response to her, saying that he was totally fine. She was surprised that he was replying in such a short way. Then he cut the conversation short, saying that he was going to get some sleep, and he wished her good night. Then, the foodie turned his attention to more of the delicious food on YouTube, choosing to completely ignore the rich girl. The girl had, of course, left another message, complaining that she was barely done eating yet, and it was just 10 in the evening. To her, that seemed too early for a young boy to sleep. He ignored her and turned his attention back to the wonderful videos that he was watching. The next day, the sun lit up the blue sky with brilliant fluffy clouds, and the happy Shin family was having breakfast as usual. The boy always loved his mother's cooking, and his mother was absolutely thrilled that her baby ate a lot. It was another normal day in their household, and the boy took up his study books so that he would keep reading. The boy got busy, writing and solving all sorts of questions as fast as he could. He had to keep his phone nearby as this was a golden rule to follow in everyday life. Sure enough, it didn't take long for him to get a message, and it was from Hiram. She wanted to say hello. Ignoring messages was also a part of his daily life, and Woojin firmly turned his attention back to his schoolwork. One had to wonder why he even made her like him if he did not like her that much. He noticed some movement outside of his bedroom window, and it was a bird just singing on a wire. A normal, peaceful and ordinary day, just the kind of thing that he liked. Since living a normal life was difficult, he had to work very hard at it. The boy got a phone call, so he had to stop his studying for a moment to pick up the phone. To his surprise, he got a message from manager Kimmy, Young from XX Capital. The man was calling regarding business or money fund loans. The boy paused when he got this call. He stood in excitement, thinking that he might have just won something, but it was very clear as a scam call. Woojin was so smart, but sometimes he was oblivious to this kind of thing. Fortunately, he had a general idea that this was a phishing scam. He kept a serious face while the man on the line told him that he had about 100 billion. The boy gasped in awe, and then he hung up because that was the proper way to handle scams like that. He got a call immediately after, and he was about to pretend it was a system error when he realized it was a call from the police. The boy immediately got serious as they asked if he was Shin Woojin, and he confirmed that he was. The caller asked if he was okay, and he assured them that he was fine. Then he was called to come into the station for a brief statement as a witness. So, the boy closed his door and prepared to leave his house. He was the only one left at home anyway, so leaving the house was rather easy. Woojin slipped out, closed the door, and opened it again for another peek because he was a little suspicious. He stared at the hallway in the normal house of his normal home, mumbling that he would be back. Then, he closed the door. This time would not be like the last time when he got abducted and tortured by horrible people. This time, for sure, he would be back. He would return every day to his happy and shining household without being late for dinner. With a very reassuring thought, Woojin left his home and made his way to the station as required. The sky looked dark and cloudy over the police station, different from the usual bright and sunny days. The hallways also looked rather dark due to the intensity of the situation. As mentioned before, it was because of the hat that he had snatched it, and he just went with his gut feeling. So, the police kept adjusting the image that they had drawn out, asking if it now looked more like the suspect that he had seen. The boy noticed that they had arrested someone who seemed to be the suspect. They asked the boy if he wanted to hear the man's voice, so they let the audio from the interrogation room seep in. The man was protesting and insisting that he was innocent, of course. It occurred to Woojin that it seemed the police just went about randomly grabbing people if they thought they fit a suspect description. The poor man insisted that he was not the one who committed the crime, but Woojin could see past lies and false denials. He focused his gaze on the man before him, registering the man's face in his eyes and making necessary comparisons to the man that he had seen before. The suspect insisted that he had never met the victim before, so he had no reason to hurt a random office worker. As the man spoke, Woojin studied every part of him closely, from his facial measurements to his nervous habits. He could tell that the man seemed to be lying, and the man was very obviously a terrible liar too. That was kind of embarrassing for him. The boy paused in his analysis and the police waited for his verdict. They wanted to know what he thought after hearing the man deny being involved in the attack. Well, Woojin stood silent for a moment, and then he said that the man was definitely lying. Woojin studied the suspect as the man loudly complained and denied the crime with all of his might. He was a rather dedicated denier of his sins, vehemently insisting that he had not committed the crime. The police officer studied the youth's expression, trying to guess what he thought about all this. After hearing all of his denials, the police then asked the boy what he thought about all this. The youth was quiet for a moment as he put together his theories and ideas in his head. Then, he finally spoke up and said that the man was almost definitely lying. The man definitely acted suspiciously, and he seemed the most like the culprit to the police. The suspect insisted that he had only been taking a walk around the neighborhood, but as he talked, Woojin noticed that the man kept touching his nose. When someone lied, catecholamines were secreted, increasing blood pressure around the nose and eyes, which sometimes made them itchy. Another sign of lying was also supposedly biting one's lips and frequently touching the face. These were subconscious actions of someone who wanted to take back their lie. When people were in danger, three actions would always emerge: their freeze, their flight, or their fight. The man's legs were crossed, proving that he had chosen to freeze. Even if he was not the culprit, stress might have made him freeze. However, they could also analyze his behavior statistically. This man, who was supposedly not the attacker, had his body language telling the story that he was afraid of being exposed. Woojin asked about the man's educational background. The police seemed surprised by the question, but they confessed that the man had a master's degree. The more educated someone was, the more they would value logical evidence. If the man was guilty, he would worry a bit more about DNA evidence, or even eyewitnesses. Then Woojin asked if the detective had mentioned any witnesses, and they admitted that this had not come up. If they said that there was a witness, the man would possibly confess. That guy who was currently yelling at his interrogator was very likely the culprit. Woojin could feel it in his bones. Then he asked the police if he could go home now. They indeed said that he could, but then asked if the boy was sure that the man was guilty. Woojin confirmed that to be the case and then told the police to take care. He did not need anyone to walk him out either. He could make it home just fine on his own. There was no evidence, and the man insisted that no one had seen his face either. Well, with that statement, the detective who had been with Woojin finally stepped into the interrogation room. It was time to test another theory. He then informed the suspect that a witness had in fact come forward and they had seen the attacker at the crime scene. The man was absolutely shocked that a witness would appear, his eyes wide in dismay and fear. The man cried out, his face in his hands, and the detective asked him to finally admit to his crimes. It hurt, but the suspect could not carry on with his lie any longer. Shakily, the man confessed that it had been an impulsive action. He had not intended to kill anyone, they had just gotten into a fight. The confession went on inside the police station. Outside, a small puddle had formed outside by the tire of the police car, and the blades of grass were green and wondrous. The boy stood outside, staring at the sky above after successfully solving yet another difficult case. The boy turned for a moment, glancing back at the building behind him. He wondered what jjajangmyeon at the police station tasted like. On his way out, he had seen a few of the staff eating. No matter what he was dealing with, Woojin would always love food. He wondered if that food was amazing and super delicious. One day he would definitely have to try it. He now had yet another thing on his bucket list, and he marched ahead to make his way home. Suddenly, he got a message from a friend greeting him. He recalled that Hiram had texted him, so he finally texted her back. Woojin informed her that the culprit had been caught so she could finally relax now. The girl was quite surprised at this message. Her classmates asked where she got her hair done since it seemed amazing and she had changed her bag. They wanted to know how much the new bag had cost. It was the same superficial and boring conversations over and over again. Hiram found that she could not care much about her shade of lip balm as she was now texting with Woojin. She asked when the man had been caught and why on earth the main character was only just replying to her message. The girl looked rather sour about being left on read for ages. Woojin then shamelessly replied that he had been busy ignoring her. The girl was shocked and could not believe it. She stared in horror at the reply and then responded that ignoring messages was quite normal after all. The girl was speechless, she had no idea how to respond to that. School was almost over, so he told her to get home safely. And she wondered how he even knew that when he did not go to school. Still, she asked what he was doing. And the main character informed the brunette that he was about to take on a challenge. Now, this interested her, and he told her that he just might succeed with her support. Naturally, this ended up intriguing Hiram enough that she showed up at the restaurant where he was, a little disgruntled and asking if he really had to do this. To Woojin, life was a series of challenges, and if there was an opportunity, one had to always take it. The boy had gotten into an eating challenge. He had 20 minutes to finish everything on the plate. If he failed or threw up, then he would lose. The failure penalty was pretty high, and she was just about willing to dump the failure cost on him. Still, Woojin was not discouraged, and he held his chopsticks high above the food on his plate, getting ready to dive in. There was no limit to the portion size, it kept increasing. The key factor, of course, was the leptin hormone. That very special hormone was secreted when eating, sending signals of fullness to the brain like a rush of aliens invading the earth. In order to beat the game, he had to finish before the leptin told him that his brain was full. The timer was ready to start whenever the boy was ready, and the genius instantly declared that he was ready. The timer was pushed, and the game began. Woojin dug into the plate in front of him, sticking his chopsticks deep inside the juicy food, scooping up the noodles, and all out shoving them into his mouth like he was a black hole. The girl squealed in shock at his sudden whirlwind eating, and both she and the timer stared in awe as Woojin stacked all the slices of meat together and chowed down on them like there was no tomorrow. She yelled at him to eat one slice at a time, but he was still going. He slurped up the noodles, grabbed his bowl off the table once he was done with the chewable bits, tossed the soup into the air, and swallowed it like a vacuum. It was eating more intensely than either the timer or Hiram had ever seen before. The man then slammed his bowl down on the table with immense satisfaction, and he stretched out his hand, much to the surprise of the two present. It was a huge success, and the boy relaxed in his chair in relief, thinking that he should ask Bomi to compliment him later, since he had finished the meal with 12 minutes to spare. He also wondered if the timer was trying to become a YouTuber or something like that. The rich girl was in awe that he had somehow managed to eat all of that food so quickly. The boy said that it was indeed not normal. Finishing all of that food was not normal either. Well, the food at the place had been amazing, and he thanked them for the meal. The restaurant also thanked him for coming over and hoped he would visit at another time. Hiram could not believe that after all that, Woojin was still interested in going out and eating a lat with Archer. To Woojin, dessert after a meal was a must, especially when one was hanging out with a girl. The rich girl thought that he was very weird, and she wanted him to know that. His actions were not very normal, and he was just about to start feeling hesitant, but it was much too late for that, and she told him to hurry. They head out for dessert, and the boy was impressed at the sweet treat. At this point, she felt that he should seriously stop watching YouTube. He was indeed reacting to most of the food that he ate like a YouTuber, cooing about how the cake was insanely good. Well, they had a little snack together, and then she grabbed her car door, opening it up and offering to drop him off at home. The boy insisted that it was fine as he wanted to take a small walk, a bit so that he could digest. So, she nodded and agreed to see him later. The boy watched her step into the vehicle, and she thought that he was indeed rather weird and unusual. This made her smile. The night sky was dark over the neighborhood, and Woojin was back in his room, watching YouTube videos once again. The boy had no intention of ever stopping. He was amazed and loved the look of the food. Suddenly, he got a call, and the boy stared at the unknown number, wondering if it was yet another scam call. He picked, and once again they all asked to confirm his name. He admitted that this was him, and he wondered if it would be another phishing scam or someone asking for a loan. It was his friend, the detective Tae-yeon Hyung. The boy recognized the detective and got a bit more interested in the call. The detective asked if this was a good time to talk, and he wanted to talk about the little tidbit that the boy had left about the YouTube channel, High School Mukbang. It was just as he had said, the victim was 20 years old. The assailants were not just one person but an entire group. All of them had met through a runaway gang. The victim had tried to run away frequently, so their family rarely looked for them and had not reported them as missing. The victim was now 20 years old, just like Woojin had guessed. Even if they were locked up and appeared on YouTube, no one would suspect or question it. This runaway gang must have known that and committed the crime. The boy had saved someone's life just by watching videos on YouTube, and they asked how he even knew and if he had some special kind of power. The boy did not really want to talk about all that and asked instead if the victim had gotten home safely. That was especially important to him as he was also a victim of kidnapping, and it meant a lot to him if the victim was able to safely get home. The detective smiled and agreed that the victim had indeed gotten home safely. They were fine now. Thanks to Woojin, the case had been solved, and the detective wanted to take him out for a meal when he was free. This was exactly the kind of thing that Woojin wanted to hear, and the opportunity was created just as planned. So, the boy asked if it would be possible to have some meat instead of a meal. There was something that he had been craving, and the detective agreed with a laugh, asking what the boy wanted to eat. It turns out that Woojin wanted to try out the Hanwoo top number 9. So, the boy said that he wanted the Hanwoo A++ number 9 sirloin special. The detective was absolutely astounded to hear this order, and he wondered if the boy was asking for tteokbul, which was basically a Korean beef soup dish prepared with marinated beef called bulgogi together with carrots, mushrooms, and naengmyeon noodles. However, the boy denied that and once again repeated his demand. He wanted the meal to be top tier, with beef. The detective had definitely never heard of it before, but he agreed. The boy had done something impressive, so Hanwoo was no big deal. They got busy arranging a meeting time, and they agreed to meet up that Saturday. The boy agreed and said that he would keep his schedule open. It's not like he was busy anyway. But he did have that one particular rich girl who liked to take his time. It was another bright day in Korea and people were going about their busy day as usual. Once again, Woojin had stepped out of his house. He had yet another very special appointment that he wanted to attend to. Today was finally the day that he would get to eat Hanwoo A++ number 9. He'd been dreaming about that delicious delicacy all night long. Someone popped up behind him, calling out to him for just a moment because they wanted to ask him something. The genius did not really have time for this, but he had been taught to be polite, so he slowed down to hear them out. The strangers beamed and told him that he seemed to have a lot of good fortune. It seemed to be a group of scammers, pretty bold of them to show up in person. Energetically, the duo told him all about how they could not pass him by when he was radiating so much good luck. The boy asked if they were talking about luck, blessings, or good fate when they said fortune. They wanted to love the scam along, so they agreed with everything. Apparently, they studied these things and they thought that his energy was very bright and beautiful, so they wanted to share some good words with him. There were many kinds of studies and learning was a lifelong journey, so Woojin curiously asked about the kind of study that they did. The duo said that they mostly focused on the principles of the universe, and now that was very interesting to the genius boy. He did not know that topic could be defined as a branch of science, just like physics. The scammers were a bit taken aback and they rushed to correct themselves. They reminded him of the saying that mountains were mountains and water was water. People did not just see nature as it was, they also assigned meaning to it. A mountain, that was a term used to describe a highland area that was densely populated with trees. Water, chemically defined as H20, a compound or hydrogen and oxygen. Then, the boy sweetly asked if there was an error in his knowledge. The scammers were starting to realize that they were getting way out of depth with this guy. But they weren't about to give up, and they insisted that his energy was so bright and his insight was different. They were really doubling down on scamming him. Then, the male scammer asked if people often told him he was handsome. Of course they did, he had a pretty face, that was the most obvious thing. Right now, they claimed that they could see his ancestor sitting on his shoulder, and he really resembles them. The boy looked so dignified. Woojin was amazed by the things these people said. They went on to say that his ancestors had been watching over him all this time. Had they now? That was rather difficult for a victim of kidnapping to believe. Still, Woojin made a huge show of looking around for them. It looked like he had not been paying proper respects. Now Woojin was amazed and he asked them if they could see ghosts. The duo seemed taken aback by the question and the lady nervously said that they didn't call them ghosts. They mostly called them ancestral spirits. Now that was bizarre to Woojin, but he was always hungry to learn. He asked them how they could perceive spirits if they were not biological organisms. Surely that only meant that they could see ghosts and they should just accept their newfound power. Normally, the human eye processes information through the macula, blind spot, and optic nerve before the brain recognizes it. He knew how the cornea worked, the iris worked, and what the pupils did to make the lens function in the way that was necessary for a person to see. Then, he asked if they had a special visual organ different from others. Had they evolved by any chance, or did they have a weird genetic mutation? The two now looked very freaked out. They should have quit while they were ahead. They clearly didn't perceive energy through wavelengths either. The male scammer started to feel nervous, sure that if they took that dude with them, something bad would surely happen. So, the female scammer laughed and said that they would have this C version at some other time, since something urgent had just come up. Woojin realized that they were trying to leave, and he read all of the woman's nervous body language. She seemed scared and reserved. This surprised him, and he said that he was not a scary person. He was just a youth that was eager to learn. But now the woman was scared of him. The scammers protested and lied about something urgent coming up, so they really had to leave. Woojin was just really curious. He was really disappointed that they wanted to sneak away. So he begged them to stay and tell him more about their very interesting powers. The scammers bolted without a moment's thought, and Woojin watched them run away feeling a little downhearted. The least he could have done was gotten them arrested. Meanwhile, there was a dude who'd watched the whole thing happen, and he'd even recorded it. The man laughed, saying that this whole interaction had been very hilarious to him. The man greeted Woojin, saying that he was from the YouTube channel Kirit TV, and Woojin immediately took interest. Many people sometimes fell for scams, so the man was the kind of person that recorded it as evidence just in case. He was a real good guy. However, he'd never seen anyone handle a scam the way Woojin had. It had been hilarious to watch. The young genius stared silently at the man, and the man beamed, asking if he could use that video as footage for his channel. Woojin immediately protested since he would not come off as normal at all, and all he wanted was to be normal. The man even offered to blur his face to hide his identity. Still, Woojin insisted that the video be deleted. It was understandable why the man clung to the video. It would be hilarious to watch and would likely give him a lot of views. For the public good, he thought that this was the kind of video that had to be shared. Woojin turned and was ready to walk away when the man begged that they would even modify his voice so he wouldn't be identifiable. No one would recognize him. Still, Woojin insisted that the video be deleted. The man began to offer money. He was rather desperate to keep that video. He finally offered to give the boy $1,000,000 and Woojin paused, pulling out his phone to collect the money. The YouTuber was shocked and perplexed at how quickly he'd switched gears. Woojin was a broke kid after all, and he would appreciate some money so he could fund his real passion, food. Well, the money was transferred and Woojin let the dude keep the video as long as his face was blurred and his voice was modified. Then the genius continued on his way, and he finally met up with the detective. The man was happy to see his special guest and asked what he wanted to eat. The boy made his special order once again of the Manhwa A++ number 9 sirloin special. It still sounded ridiculous to the detective, but he nervously checked the menu and all the expensive prices that came with it. If it was too expensive, the boy then gently said that something else was fine too. However, the detective did not want to go back on his word. So, the man asked for 3 servings of some of that special beef. Then he beamed and thanked Woojin. If they had been even a little late, it would have been a disaster. When they arrived at the scene, it was complete chaos. That poor girl had ripped out the screen and was about to jump out of the window. It had scared the police officer to see her like that. The boy was also relieved that they had gotten there on time, and the waiter popped in with the food that they had ordered. The detective had been so busy so he'd forgotten to ask, but he asked how the boy had been and if he was holding up well. He looked so different from the haggard boy that they had rescued, but they had to make sure that the boy was doing well. The boy admitted that he had been trying to live a rather normal life. The detective recalled how the boy had been able to identify the lady that had been asking for help, recognizing a captive victim because he had been captive himself. Woojin was also really smart and could easily recognize patterns and behaviors. He could even guess the hobbies of strangers that he'd seen only for a moment. The boy was anything but normal, and he wondered if it was trauma from an accident that made the boy so invested in studying crime. The sirloin meat was served, ready for making, and the two stared at that beautiful shining meat in awe. Woojin was drooling just watching it get fried on the heater. The waiter encouraged them to try it out with just salt at first. The meat was served on a plate and the genius cried tears of joy to see his dreams come true. One delicious bite and it transported him to a world of joy and wonder. It felt like he had been hit with holy and wonderful inspiration, and the boy gasped in wonder and delight. This food was definitely 100% worth it in every way. The detective got a little worried at the boy's awestruck expression, and he asked if the boy had somehow bitten his tongue. That was not the case at all, however. Hesitant, the detective took a bite from his food, and he also experienced some legendary divine encounter, his eyes popping wide with shock and amazement. That food was unlike anything they had ever taken before. The meat melted in their mouth and it was worth every penny. The juices were insanely good too. The man had to remind Woojin to stay focused or he would end up eating the rest. The boy told him to hurry and grab another piece. The genius had a lot of fun trying out the meat, and he thanked the waiter of course each time that they were served. The detective was rather thrilled at the boy's good and polite manners. As expected, the food was crazy delicious and they were both having the time of their lives. Then, Woojin asked if he should order some naengmyeon as well. As expected of the detective, he knew the golden rule that the meal was just not complete without naengmyeon. If there was not enough meat, then they could just order some more. The two laughed because they were having so much fun, and they insisted that it was fine. The night went very well as the sun set over Korea. The darkness turned to day, and the fluffy white clouds were back in the sky. The young genius was at his table, studying as usual. Most of the family was home that day, and the mother popped up with some watermelon for the family to enjoy. Later in the day, the brother taught his sister a bit of her work to help her learn better in school. Then, the genius headed out later that day to enjoy a bit of the world around them. He hung out with Hiram at a cafe. Even though he said he was just using her, he seemed to be enjoying her company finally. They went out to the library to read a bit more and study, because that's what he enjoyed the most, and daily life continued with every day that passed. Students went to school, sitting at a desk and looking out the large windows as they learnt. The leaves on the trees had started to fade away from green to yellow, and they gently lost their color. The leaves scattered all around the roads and the snow came down. Seniors were greeted and told good luck, and everyone was encouraged to do their best and to stick to the test like glue. The young boy stared ahead. He had prepared all summer for this exam, and he was finally taking the college entrance exam. All sorts of people had showed up to cheer on their children. Woojin walked in with the other students and picked out a seat like the other students. Everyone sat in the exam hall and the test was ready to begin. Papers were handed out to everyone and they all passed examination papers quietly among themselves so that everyone would get one. Then, the exam began and the youth was ready to answer some questions. It was time for them to get started. The seniors were wished good luck and everyone was encouraged to do their best in the exam. The exam eventually came to an end, and the boy began walking from the exam location. The boy groaned, realizing white horror that he might have made an irreversible mistake while writing his exam. Other students were making their way home after the exam. The main character recalled that his mother always said that she was fine as long as she was healthy. And she even said that he did not have to be good at studying. She just wanted him to live a normal and happy life. He made his way to the house and he could already picture the happy smiles that he would be greeted with once he made it back home. Still, the boy groaned as he wondered how he was going to explain what he'd done at the exam hall. The boy sort of snuck into his own house, but his sister was waiting for him at the door, and she was thrilled. She asked if he had done well on his test, but was taken aback to see how gloomy her brother looked. The girl was shocked. He kept going and the sister worried that he had somehow messed up the exam. However, she recalled that her brother was super smart and very good at answering questions, so there was no way that he could have possibly failed the exam. Then, she hesitantly asked if he was okay, and if something bad had happened. The boy lowered his head, saying that he had been a bit too overconfident in himself. Now the sister wondered if he'd really messed up the test because he was too nervous. So, the sister tried to cheer him up, saying that it didn't matter if he didn't do well in the test and that there was always another chance, no one was blaming him. The boy smiled and said he was going to wash up now. He headed inside tiredly and his sister watched him with concern. The boy needed some time alone as he took off his jacket and his bag. He wanted to sulk for a bit. Theron sent a message to ask if he'd done well on his test, and at this point, Woojin was just about tired of hearing about that awful test. He ignored her message as usual since that was about the only normal thing he had left. The boy sighed, realizing that he had solved way too many practice books for no reason. Later, when he was all washed up, he came out to join his sister in the living room. The boy was still sulking about the test. It was the first time that she had ever seen her brother so downtrodden. Even when he had at first been hesitant and unsure, he'd still been so full of life. Now, she wondered how she was supposed to comfort him when he was in this state. Then she got a call from their mother, asking if her brother was home. Their mother wanted to know what her son wanted to eat after such a hard exams. The girl admitted that it seemed her brother had not performed as well as he wanted to on the test, and his face looked really bad. The father was surprised that their son was home already, but the mother and sister worried that the son was feeling down because he did not do well. The father immediately wanted to talk to his son. They asked the sister if he really messed up, and she admitted that she hadn't gotten to talk to him about it, but he did look very disappointed. It was just one test, and the father assured him that it was fine, and these things happened sometimes. He would grab some good food and head over soon so that they could cheer him up. Woojin then appeared in the living room once again after the call had ended. Bomi called out to her brother, reassuring him again that it was perfectly okay. The boy might have gotten a lot of answers wrong, but mom and dad would still bring all of his favorite things for him to enjoy. The boy just groaned even more and finally confessed his painful malady. He had not been normal. Yes, this one terrible thing was the problem all along. The poor painfully gifted main character had gone into the exam hall expecting difficult questions, but the exam had been frightfully easy. Before he knew it, he's answered all the questions without even thinking of how abnormal it would be for him to get them all right. Indeed, Woojin's regret was that he could not rewind time and get a few of the answers wrong on purpose, just so that he could seem more like a normal student. His sister was baffled by this confession. She was so shocked to hear this that her spirit left her body for a hot minute. Surely anyone who got all the questions right should be overflowing with happiness and confidence. However, the main character didn't want anything like that. He just wanted to look normal. She wondered if it was because he had solved too many practice books. His hands had moved reflexively without thinking, like how people's joints moved without noticing, or how people breathed unconsciously. Before he knew it, all the questions were solved and he was left staring at his hands like he was one kind of monster. Bomi was shocked by his despair and she called out to him, grabbing his hands and shaking him back to his senses. She yelled that he couldn't just say that, especially outside. Saying that he got absolutely everything correct before the marking came in could make things difficult for him. The two siblings sighed and then tried to hope for the possibility that he may have gotten a few of the answers wrong. That would be nice. His sister asked if he had the answers that he marked for self-grading. The boy remembered all of the answers so he didn't even need to mark them. The girl was shocked that he memorized the answers. But that legit sounded like just another random thing that he could do. Woojin protested that he'd solved the questions himself so of course he would remember all of his answers. So, they were going to check, and hopefully they would find that he definitely got a few answers wrong. So, they opened the tab to all the questions that had come out in the exam and his sister quizzed him on them to get the answers while Woojin sulked. So, the sister called out each of the questions while her brother gave her the answer with his eyes closed. She realized that he got the first question right but they tried to see if 2 was wrong. He started calling out all of his answers, since he had them memorized easily by the number he chose and Bomi checked each answer with her eyes wide. This was a rather difficult situation. Not only had he perfectly memorized each answer that he'd given, he's also answered each question correctly. What a painful reality it was. Woojin was still blind as he called out his answers, and he asked if she was listening, because his sister had stopped talking. It was really hard for her to talk in this situation, and the boy hopefully asked if he had gotten any of the answers wrong. He could have made some mistakes in some of the other subjects, so Bomi said they should check everything first. So they tried math, which was sure to have some wrong answers, so he called out his answers and she checked everything very carefully. When he was done, he asked how the situation was looking. The situation was looking very bad, but in a good way. The girl turned, very amazed as she stared at her brother. The poor boy looked so crestfallen, and she took his hands like she was confessing that his wife was dead. Unfortunately, it was just as he feared. The poor boy had definitely gotten all of the answers right. Still, Bomi tried to encourage him to celebrate. It was not a bad thing that he'd gotten every answer correctly. However, the boy was so upset because getting all the answers right was absolutely not a normal thing to do. Their mother and father would be shocked and thrilled if he got everything right. His sister was so sweet and trying to make him feel better. He already knew his parents would be happy, but he wasn't happy. It was like Woojin was thinking on an entirely different level and that made him feel worse because it wasn't normal. The boy looked on the verge of tears. Honestly, Bomi was thinking he should just accept his fate because someone who could solve a crime just by looking at one person wasn't normal to begin with. Their parents finally arrived home and his sister raced out to greet them. His brother tried to stop her, but the girl immediately announced to her parents that her brother had gotten a perfect score. That instantly soared his mood, and the poor boy sulked in mad despair. The parents were stunned because they'd been so sure that their precious boy had failed the test, but it seemed that wasn't the case. His parents were excited and asked if it was true that he'd really aced the test. The father dropped all of the shopping bags with excitement, and he happily hugged his son, screaming about how the boy surely took after him. The mother also insisted that her son had gotten his genius from her. Altogether, the parents were overjoyed and happy for their darling genius. The father was so excited that he yelled that he wanted everyone to get called together the next day. It was his treat. He was so happy that he wanted to celebrate his son's success. The man laughed when they asked if something had happened, and he happily told all of his friends that his son had gotten a perfect score. He boasted that his son took after him since he was super smart. The mother protested that he got the brains from him. At any rate, the invitation had been sent out, and the father insisted that the invited guests even bring more guests. Woojin was in despair that his father was telling everyone about his abnormal he was. In the father's opinion, he beamed and realized that his sweet boy could become a doctor. He definitely had the brains and the potential to achieve that. If not, then his son could become a prosecutor, and he would be so good at that. He would get evidence far and wide. He could even be a lawyer. The father imagined all sorts of wonderful jobs for his sweet boy. Woojin could become an appraiser, an accountant, a tax officer even. The mother smacked the man, telling him not to pressure their darling son. Woojin could become whatever he wanted to be, and he would attend whichever university that he wanted to go to. She just wanted her son to be happy and comfortable. The boy immediately said that he wanted to go to a normal university. They all stared blankly at that very vague answer and then asked which university he considered to be normal. The father laughed hesitantly, wondering why their daring and precious genius boy wanted to go to a normal university. His sister then asked what major he wanted to study. Woojin thought about it for a hot minute, and then he confessed that he had not decided that yet. Since the boy had not made a decision for himself, the father was happy to push all sorts of dreams in his defection. An appraiser was a good idea of work he could get into, as well as an accountant of a tax officer. Now, the boy sat at his table, trying to figure out what sort of major he should pursue. Naturally, he went searching on the internet, checking out all of the most normal-looking and garage jobs that he could find. He read about a judicial scrivener who drafts legal documents for courts and prosecutors. A tax officer was a big that managed and handled tax affairs. An architect worked in designing, supervising, and construction. Woojin also considered the notions of a doctor and a prosecutor. The jobs his dad mentioned all seemed to follow a pattern. They all operated within the legal framework of some kind, and they upheld the long arm of justice. He also researched a long list of competent prosecutors. There was Prosecutor Lee Jong-mi and Dr. Im Jae-jun, also accountant Shin Dong-min, lawyer Park Soo-jin, director Jong Yong-ta, and tax officer Kim Do-won. All of these people graduated from a particular university. So, Woojin wondered if that university was the most normal university. The poor boy had mistaken popularity for normalcy, but at least he would pursue a good future. So, the youth popped out of his room and came out the living room where the family was hanging out. He had decided the university that he wanted to go to, and he said that he would attend the S university, like a normal person. It was the absolute most abnormal university that he could choose, and for a hot moment, his family was stunned speechless. That place was not normal at all, and his father even dropped the remote in shock. However, his father was thrilled. He laughed happily and said that places like Harvard would not be considered normal, so they would aim for the very normal S university. They knew darn well that they were lying to the poor boy, but it was at least better than watching him limit his own growth. Night fell over the normal household, and the neighborhood was beautiful at night as always. The CSAT score reports came out, and all sorts of families handled the news differently. Of course, our guy was ranked #1 for his ridiculously over-the-top scores. There were celebrations from other families as students graduated and moved on to the university to continue their studies. Time passed, and now we moved to the very important scene of a train in the snow. The train chugged along the snowy track, long and determined in its non-stop journey to its destination. Woojin sat inside of the train, rummaging through his bag. The boy beamed. He pulled out from his bag an egg and a drink. He had always wanted to do this, and with excitement, he cracked the egg of his head. The main character's a bucket list sure was an odd collection of things. The eggshell cracked in his hand, and he very carefully peeled off the shell of the boiled egg. Then he ate that on the train as his snack. After eating the egg, he took a sip of soda to wash it down. The soda was cool and refreshing as it washed down his throat, and he beamed, realizing that this must be why people ate on trains. It was a wonderful experience, and an amazing combination. The snow continued to fall, and the people were thanked for using the high-speed rail. They were then wished a safe journey as they descended from the train. Woojin hopped out of the train and then boarded a bus. The bus moved carefully down the road, and the genius came down at his bus stop. The transit was not at all an easy thing, and he walked out as he headed to a big building. It took a few moments of walking it. He got to the gate and was then asked to sign a few documents. Woojin signed without making a fuss, and then he was escorted to a certain room. He was told to wait there for a moment, and the youth thanked the person that guided him. It almost looked like a jail and an interrogation room, and the genius stared ahead at the door in front of him. Woojin had a flashback as he recalled a man screaming and calling him names. It was a dark time of his memory, when the man had threatened to beat him until he understood. The man had also yelled that the boy could not do one thing, and he called him an idiot. It seemed that Woojin had indeed come to a prison, and a prisoner was escorted out in handcuffs. The genius looked with his eyes at the man who had tortured and maltreated him for 12 years. It was like a princess who had shown up to check up on her evil stepmother, and the prisoner was tense to see the genius. The man asked why the genius boy had come, and if he had come to see him suffering. Our guy stared silently at the man, and then the man laughed, pointing at his ears and mocking the boy. He jeered that the boy could not hear or understand him, since they'd beat the poor victim until he'd gone disabled and deaf. The man then grinned, knowing that the boy could at least read his lips, so he cursed him out and claimed ownership over Woojin. The wicked man asked the genius how he had been, recognizing him easily. He claimed that the boy was the one who had killed his family, and he got hysterical as he cursed and screamed and accused the boy of the crime. The genius promised himself that he would feel no more fear from this person and no more emotions towards him. He had gone back to that awful room that he had been locked in, looking at all the books that had been his only companions in that nightmare. Now, he would experience complete freedom. The boy had happily walked away from his dark past, and now he was confronting the dark taskmaster that had once made his life a living hell. The wicked man got panicked at the boy's confidence, yelling at him to stop, and to get back inside the dark cage where he had held him captive for years. However, Woojin spoke, reminding the prisoner that the roles were reversed now. There was no reason for him to cower in fear or to be stuck inside a terrible small box anymore. He asked the man if he was afraid of him. Yes, the genius had come all this way to confirm that very fact. He hoped that wicked rat was indeed scared of him. The man still accused the boy of ending his entire family, still blaming him for his problems. His sister-in-law, she'd had no interest in medicinal herbs at all, and she also used to beat the poor boy with a stick every day. He got multiple scars thanks to the man's wicked sister-in-law. The prison uniform for the wicked man very well in Woojin's opinion. The man was shocked, realizing that the brat was talking, and fear came over him when he realized that the boy could hear him. The genius noted that the man's voice was trembling now. He was now in number 2038. His family had died one by one each year from all sorts of heart attacks and poisoning. The man screamed, cursing at the boy. However, the man needed to relax. People only saw what they wanted to see, and they believed what they wanted to believe. The police officer warned the prisoner not to touch the glass or he would get punished for it. People only wanted to hear what would validate their thoughts. Well, he would not give the man that satisfaction. Inmate 2038 had beat up 2 of his acquaintances as well, and those 2 had ended up dead. They had died from heart attacks. Goosebumps rose around the trembling man's hands, even as he tried to curse our guy out. The man terribly wanted to block the boy's voice, and his increased heart rate, blood pooled in his chest. The boy wondered if he ought to push a little further, to hit the climax that would finally send this wicked man over the edge. The wicked monster that lived inside of him was hungry for blood, and it was currently disguised as a well-dressed gentleman talking to a crazy inmate. The boy admitted that lately he'd been having a bit of a dilemma. He stared darkly at the men across the glass, who looked at him with surprise and fear. The wicked man's new name was Inmate 2038. The boy called each number with a dangerous threat in his voice. He wondered if he should carve the man's release date onto his body, just so that he could not forget, so that he could find him and keep tormenting him. The wicked man screamed in a rage, asking if the boy was threatening him now. The genius laughed, saying of course not, as he looked at the man with the trembling hands. See, he was just worried about his health. He asked the trembling man if he had been writing an autobiography. He wondered what that book would say, whether it would be full of the lies or the truth. The man in prison trembled, asking how on earth the boy could have known about that. See, he had indeed been writing an autobiography in his spare time. The youth smirked wickedly, telling the man that for his health, he should not eat until he was full. He should always put down his spoon before he felt satisfied. He should also try to get some moderate exercise and avoid sunlight as much as possible. Yes, if the wicked man wanted to survive this revenge, he should focus on staying healthy. Now, the man looked agitated and scared. The monster that lived inside the boy even spoke about depositing some money into the man's prison account with a wicked look in his eyes. The boy did not have much because he was not working yet, but he would try to send in some money from time to time. Now that wicked man was truly losing his mind in despair. Prison funds were all part of the plan set up to keep the boy in his thoughts constantly. The genius wicked plan was to live in this man's mind rent-free. And the more they spoke, the more agitated and scared the poor prisoner became. The wicked man screamed, falling back in his chair. He screamed and cried that the boy was a murderer. He accused the boy of killing his family and his neighbors. He even cursed him out. He yelled that this boy had killed them all. To Woojin, his former torturer was now just another boring person. Still, he wasn't done teasing him. The police called out to inmate 2038 and told him to calm down. The poor panicked man instead, insisting that the boy had one of his lackeys watching them right now. He yelled that the boy was a terrible culprit who had committed murder. The policeman told the inmate to calm down and even tried to restrain him. Even if his former bully was now boring, Woojin still thought he was kind of an interesting person. He stared at the panicking man, trying to imagine how on earth such a coward could have possibly held him prisoner. Casually, he just said he would see him again at another time, and then he left. Time passed, and the boy had taken the train all the way back home. He put on his bag and he walked down the snowy path up some stairs. The snow continued to come down upon the beautiful city and people walked around, talking about the weather. There were couples and there were normal people. The kind of life that he had always wanted to live. The genius looked down at the snow that fell on his hands. They were microscopic ice particles formed around vapor and they fell to the ground due to gravity. Beautiful, wonderful snowflakes that fell like magic and made people happy depending on the person's environment. Snow could bring out joy, but for the longest time snow had been nothing but a terror for him and a source of stress. He had been locked in that terrible cage, shivering with only book to keep him warm, with no comfort, no family, and no home. This was why environment was incredibly important. It could shape a person or break them down. However, even in this cold weather, he did not think that it could take away the warmth of people. The boy noticed a group of girls making their way to him, and he recognized his sister among them. He pulled out his phone and called his sister, asking where she was since they were supposed to meet up. His sister smiled and said that she was heading home now. Then, she asked where he was. Well, she was right in front of him and he could see her, so he told her about that. She was surprised and looked for him. Then she noticed her brother waving cheeky at her. The girl was surprised and she ran over to her brother with joy. Her race to him was as beautiful as the falling snowflakes. She ran to him with a smile on her face. And it was something that had never happened to him before in the snow. The snow might be slippery, but she didn't even look at the ground. She was only focused on him. This was the kind of life that Woojin enjoyed. A wonderful, peaceful, normal thing. This was why environment was so important to people. His sister's brilliant smiling face was everything he'd ever dreamed of while being locked in captivity. So, in this environment, he could properly enjoy himself. His sister threw herself into his arms, and he caught her immediately. The genius wondered if he had finally attained true happiness living like this. The girl smiled, asking her brother where he was coming from, and he just said that he went to see someone he knew, like he hadn't been torturing a grown man a few minutes ago. The girl was surprised to hear this because she knew her brother didn't know a lot of people. Meanwhile, her friends watched the exchange with awe because they had never seen their friend's brother before. The genius assured her that it was just someone he used to know in the past, and he didn't need to see that person anymore. His sister was kind of confused, but she was quite used to her brother being a totally weirdo by now, so she just accepted it. Then he reached into his bag, rummaging around a bit before popping out with a box. He had something for his sister to try. She wondered what it was and he opened the box to reveal some glistening and yummy takoyaki. Takoyaki was really good and he had wrapped it up so it would not get cold. His sister was impressed and ready to try some. She was happy that he had thought to save some just for her, and he encouraged her to try it because it was really delicious. The snow continued to fall over the environment and it was a happy atmosphere for the siblings. The next day, the sky was bright, and the clouds were fluffy and flowers bloomed as winter turned to spring. It was time for work and school to resume, and people made their way living their daily lives in the calm and peaceful neighborhood where our genius lived. He was on his way out with his bag strapped to his back, and he noticed the poster that he stopped to look at for a moment. He could already guess the real purpose for that event, but then he knew that there was no such thing as a free lunch. Anyway, the boy kept walking over to a big brown building. Inside the big brown building, he found that he had entered a lecture hall. Sitting in the middle was the most normal thing to do so naturally, that's the chair that he chose. Before he could sit, someone came over to say hello. It was a man and his name was Park Jung-wook. The boy smiled and he waved happily to the new student, saying that it was nice to meet him. Woojin had officially made his first causal acquaintance at school, and the boy was surprised. He'd been added to the University Business Administration freshman group chat. On the group chat, the freshmen helped each other answer all sorts of questions to help them get settled into the university. The genius thus recognized the name of Park Jung-wook from the freshman group chat. The genius said that it was nice to meet him and said that they should get along and not fight. The bespectacled boy laughed at that introduction and agreed. He also wondered why the other boy sounded like a textbook, but he didn't address that. He asked the boy if he knew about the gathering after class. Yes, Woojin knew. Then Jung-wook turned and acknowledged a girl that had just walked into class. Her name was Songi. There were many new students finding their way in class. They wanted to know if there was a seat available. They talked about sitting next to friends, and some even met up with their friends. Just normal people doing normal kid stuff. The genius was excited for his first university lecture. He had always wanted to experience this, and he sat with bated breath, waiting for the teacher to come in. Eventually, the door opened and the teacher stepped up onto the podium and welcomed everyone to class. This man addressed the class and said that he would be their business administration professor, and the genius stared. The man smiled and said that he would be introducing everyone to business, and he asked if they knew what business, or what business meant to them. He asked if anyone wanted to answer, and said that they would have to raise their hand and answer. There was silence as nobody wanted to answer the question. Woojin reasoned that raising his hand would not be normal, so he kept his hand down. Suddenly the teacher decided to just point out people at random in class to answer the question. He asked a student in a blue shirt to answer. The boy panicked and then just mumbled about business being about leading a company. So, the teacher pointed to the person in the white shirt and asked them to describe business. That person said that it was about managing and operating a business. Well, all of these were valid answers to the teacher, and then he asked what a good business leader should be good at. He pointed to the students at the back. The nervous girl that he picked said that they should be good at planning and giving directions. They were all rather cliché answers, but teacher was encouraging and said that answer was good. Then he asked the student next to her to answer that question, and unfortunately for the whole class, the student next to her was our genius. The disgruntled boy wondered if he got called because he sat in the middle seat. Well, he got picked so he might as well answer. So the boy was ready to answer, and he said that a good business person should be good at persuasion. The teacher was confused about that answer, asked him to expand on that. The teacher wanted to know what the genius meant by that. Now the professor had really dug them into a pit. That was when the genius in Woojin activated, and he remembered reading the poster on the 16th Genius Investment Security of Stock Trading. It was an investment competition that promised scholarship, internship, and overseas tour opportunities. The poster said that the Genius Investment Securities was hosting a stock trading competition for all university students, so they should challenge themselves, become the stocking, and win various prizes. Woojin felt that this should be a fitting example, and then he launched into an explanation of how he had seen a security firm was holding a stock trading competition. People imagine the prize money and feel the urge to take on the challenge. However, on the other hand, it can also be seen as a form of enticement designed by the security company, like cheese in a mousetrap leading them to try it out. It was a method to identify individuals who had been skilled in stock trading from an early stage. If someone placed first or second, the security company could then provide supports that recruits them into their firm. This would create connections with the first and second place winners through scholarships and similar incentives. Their teacher was impressed by this explanation, but Woojin just kept going. He said that when they watched advertisement, their brains would enter a form of hypnosis. His classmates were also impressed as the genius explained that business leaders would know how to take advantage of this advertisement. They would make people want to buy things or make them they want to have it. People would also feel compelled to go to certain places, or they would want to own things. That was the magic of advertisement. Sometimes people were even compelled to buy certain things as a gift for their friend or family who liked that kind of thing. Advertisements made people crave something, and the students were amazed as the boy kept talking. The skill to make people want and desire was called marketing, but from a broad perspective, that kind of massive civilized society was fundamentally built on persuasion, and that was why we had modern industry today. There was silence in the class. It was not a normal answer at all. The boy then raised his hand, called the professor, and asked when the actual lecture would start. He just wanted to take a normal class, but he had gone and made everything absolutely abnormal from the first day. There was drop-dead silence in class, and absolutely everyone was focused on him. Their gaze was incredible, and they stared in shock at this boy that just left their professor speechless. He had pretty much covered the entire topic with his brief explanation, so there was very little left to teach. The professor then finally spoke, amazed that his student had such an excellent answer. Fortunately, he was the brilliant kind of professor and not the kind with a fragile ego that would get crushed by having a genius in his classroom. He already knew about the genius that got a perfect score on the exam, so he was rather ready for him. There was silence as the class suddenly turned and started clapping for him, following the teacher's lead. No matter how one looked at it, that kind of reaction was friendly, not normal. Woojin looked perplexed. Being normal was indeed much more harder than he thought, and he felt that he needed to try harder. He had been sure that it was a normal answer, but he was dead wrong. Now, it was time for them to begin their first class and lecture, and the introduction to business administration began. The man asked if any of them knew how to define business administration, and the boy looked in awe at the long-awaited lecture that was finally going to begin. He'd waited for this for quite a while. Business administration was the study of how to efficiently and effectively manage an organization. The professor explained all of that to the class. Woojin nodded in agreement as he remembered that definition. The core of business was planning, organizing, leadership, and control, as the teacher displayed on his PowerPoint presentation on screen before the students. These 4 processes made up business management. The first topic that they were going to cover was planning, and this involved setting goals and creating strategies to achieve them. It was the core of business management. The students listened carefully, and Woojin realized with dismay that he already knew this. As the lecture went on, the teacher explained leading, which was motivating people, leading them and achieving goals through the power of teamwork. The next was controlling, which was the step where a person checked if everything was going as planned and make necessary adjustments. Each PowerPoint highlighted topics that Woojin found that he had already seen before. In fact, he had read so many books that he might as well teach the class himself. Still, the boy struggled to listen. He still tried his best to enjoy the university lecture, and the girl beside him stared at him. The boy then wondered if he had been asked to answer that last question, because the professor noticed that he wasn't paying as much attention as the other students. In that case, he was going to do his best and not let his guard down, so the genius kept his eyes glued to the screen, listening carefully. This lecture continued until 10:08, then the lecture finally came to an end for the day. The teacher then told them to enjoy their lunch and he would see them next time. After the class, students started filing out and making their way home. Finally, it was time to eat the legendary campus meal. The genius had waited for this moment as well. The students all rushed out of class, telling each other to enjoy their meals, and they made their way to the cafeteria. Students walked around the university compound and went from lecture halls to the cafeteria. They eventually got to the cafeteria, and the genius was impressed to see such a crowded eating area. Woojin walked over, trying to be as normal as possible and joining the line. He got his food tray and excitedly sat down to enjoy the delicacy. Unfortunately, as he ate, he did not do it in a normal way. Everyone was staring at him. The boy cleaned his plate at the end of the meal and set down his spoon. He sat in silence as he thought for a moment this food was lacking MSG. He stared sadly at his empty plate, thinking that MSG was way safer than salt though, and he wondered if this was intentional because it was a school meal. Suddenly, he got a message from the detective Kim Tae-yun. The detective wanted to know if he was busy. The boy sent in his reply that he had just finished eating his meal and he was very busy. He didn't want anything to mess up his perfectly normal school life. Soon, his phone began to ring, so he picked up the call, even though he had said that he was busy. The detective said that he was having a tricky case, so he really needed some help. He would even give the boy 100,000 if he helped him out overtime. The boy had in fact been helping the detective with some cases. Sometimes the detective would come over and show him some stuff, and he would help out with identifying if the culprit was innocent or not, and if they had an alibi. In fact, the boy had solved a few cases, and every time he solved a few cases, the detective would take him out for lunch. Every time he managed to solve a good case, the detective would buy him a good meal, and it was good business. Every time Woojin solved a case, he got some free meat. He could not resist good meat. Besides, he got to eat as much as he wanted, or the kind detective would give him some money while happily thanking the boy. It was an easy way to make money, so of course the genius kept taking the cases. So he told the detective to send over the case. However, the detective said that he wanted them to talk in person and asked when the boy would finish what he was doing. The genius was surprised to hear this and was a little confused. Suddenly, he got a message that due to the professor's circumstances the afternoon lecture was cancelled. With this sudden stroke of luck, his calendar was freed up in that case. So, the boy said that he was free, and he asked detective where he was and where he should go to meet up with him. The genius headed out into the campus environment to walk among the trees. The detective said that he would come to pick him up, so the genius waited. It was a bright summer's day in Korea that afternoon, and the detective was waiting by his car as he messaged Genius, trying to figure out where he was. Woojin spotted him and came over, and the detective waved him over to the car. They greeted at each other, and the detective was happy, saying that the boy looked even better now that he was a college student. He was so impressed about how much the boy had grown since the university wasn't just any school. Then the boy asked what kind of case it was, and the detective said that they should talk inside the car. It was very confidential, so they both had to go inside the car. Then the man reached behind him, rummaging inside a bag. The youth then made a suggestion to the detective. Instead of just watching videos or looking pictures, since this was a very important case, he wanted to ask if they could visit the scene of the crime. The detective was surprised about this request. Usually people lived based on experience. It was like tracing a path from the bus or ordering a meal on the street. That was why the more experience you had, the more useful it became, especially when trying to solve a case. The boy wanted to experience the situation firsthand. Maybe that would help solve it better. The detective thought about it for a moment, and then he said that if the boy insisted, then they could go. So he kicked the car into gear, and they took off towards the scene, zooming through the streets of Korea. They ended up in a quiet neighborhood, and the detective pointed out that the case took place on the third floor. He asked the boy if he was ready, and Woojin said that he was ready to go. They both made their upstairs, and they found a police officer standing beside a door taped over with yellow police tape. That was likely the scene of the crime. The two approached the man, and the detective thanked the police officer for his hard work. The man had stood there, guarding the door, and the man at the door said it was no problem. Then the detective asked the youth once again if the boy was really fine with coming onto the scene. The genius boy insisted that he needed to experience it. The police officer looked a bit surprised, but he opened the tape for them to pass. It was bloody. It looked like a murder scene. There were stains on the ground, and they were traces of where a victim had fallen and died. The white tape on the ground showed where the body had been found, and the boy stood at the door, staring at it. The young genius got serious when he realized how difficult the case was. There was blood splattered even on the wall, and this was not something to be taken lightly. Instantly his genius activated, and he could visualize the movement of perhaps the victim or the attacker through the house. Woojin could guess when the door had opened, and who had come in, and how the brutal attack had taken place. It seemed that someone had rushed in quickly into the house and then pulled out a knife, surprising the person who lived inside. The attacker then unleashed his first attack, stabbing the house's occupant and taking him down with the attack of surprise. The deadly weapon would have been raised high, oozing its deadlines, and then it would have been brought down once again. That deadly knife had been used to take the life of the poor victim, making a bloody mess. Blood splattered on the walls and all over the floor. It would have been a very violent crime, especially if the victim tried running for his life. The victim had likely staggered back in fear of the knife, and he would have tried to escape, but he was attacked again. A harsh stab in his midsection likely sent the victim flying down, which is what caused the trail of blood. The victim might have crawled away from the door and eventually landed in the center of the room. Yes, Woojin could visualize where the victim would have likely fallen, and then tried to possibly drag himself away from the attacker. The attacker would have stood in the blood and his clothes would be stained as well as his shoes. The attacker would have likely then launched again, grabbing the victim before he could get away. The villain would cover the man's mouth with his bloody hands while the victim looked at him and plead, begging for him to get off and let go. His eyes would roll to the back of his head as he slowly lost consciousness, and then in that moment of weakness, the attacker would lean over the body. The genius could see everything play out before his eyes. The throat was likely targeted first. That's what he said as he studied all of the prints that had been left behind. Excessive bleeding from a stab wound on the right side of the neck likely caused most of the blood stains. The weapon used was a knife. It wasn't kitchen knife either. It wasn't an impulsive crime. This was premeditated, especially with this much violence. It was the perpetrator's goal to murder. The detective beamed with pride, saying that this was as expected of his little brother. He knew that Woojin could figure things out just by looking at the scene. Then the genius asked if they had found anything else. The detective admitted that they had seen nothing so far, and he showed the suspect's CCTV footage. He asked the boy if he wanted to take a look as well. The genius boy took a look and then he asked about fingerprints and if they seen any clues on that. They had also found nothing on that, which meant that the murderer had come prepared to escape with his crime. Unfortunately, he was not prepared for a genius being involved in this case. Suddenly, Woojin noticed something as he inspected the CCTV footage of the suspect. In the video, he saw a blonde man at the door, and they only saw the back of this man. Then they saw the victim open the door to let this man inside. The suspect clearly knew the victim, and that was identifiable from the happy smile on the victim's face. It was a male estimated to be 180 centimeters tall, with blonde hair and no fingerprints. The man held a plastic bag, possibly with a soju bottle inside. His shoe size was 217 mm. The detective said that was right. Then the genius asked if this suspect had been caught yet. This was because it did not seem that this obvious suspect person was the real culprit at all. There was a plot twist in this case. The detective admitted that they had in fact caught the blonde suspect, but he wondered why the boy thought that he wasn't the attacker. They had him on camera entering the premises, so it seemed most likely that he was the killer, especially as all circumstantial evidence pointed towards the suspect as the culprit. However, that was precisely why it was a bit too easy. Plus, Woojin added that if the detective truly believed that, then he would not have asked for the genius to come investigate the case. The detective knew that it wouldn't be that easy to fool the young boy and laughed at himself for trying. He admitted that the suspect was not confessing to the crime no matter what they tried. Besides, something felt off. It sounded like the suspect's alibi was rather ambiguous. That was on the money because the man they'd brought in claimed that he did not go home that night. In fact, that man had stayed in a motel. However, he'd paid in cash, so there were no timestamp receipts. Even weird was the fact that the motel's CCTV had been conveniently found broken. The motel owner was also drunk and couldn't confirm anything they needed. Apparently, the owner could not even remember which room the suspect stayed in. On inspecting the area, they had found a hair strand that they'd carefully picked up with some investigation tools. That strand of hair was tested, and the young genius looked through all the evidence they had gathered so far. The authorities were aware that the murder weapon appears to be a long and sharp knife, much like a sashimi knife. If the boy just described what he saw, assuming the culprit was proficient with a sashimi knife made things easier. Criminals tended to lean towards committing crimes with tools that they were familiar with. That's why a construction worker would probably favor a hammer for a crime of passion or sudden rage. Someone who worked in a boxing factory would also favor using tape or the quiet of a warehouse for their hiding place. People believed that using something families would reduce unexpected variables. If they assumed that the perpetrator worked in a profession that involved water, then it would indeed make sense why no fingerprints were found. Despite ringing the doorbell with bare hands, the detective admitted that did make a lot of sense, but he had no idea where the genius was going with this. So Woojin expanded on his logic. He explained that people who frequently worked with water would often develop severe eczema, which could erase fingerprints. The hair found at a crime scene could be an animal's fur, for instance, or it could belong to someone completely different. It might even be synthetic hair. The detective asked more about this, curious because this was an angle he hadn't even thought of before. See, it was really quite possible that the culprit had worn a wig. Now this was an interesting theory, and the detective wanted to know more. There was the possibility that the attacker had disguised themselves before committing the murder, and that would be the perfect avenue to create confusion. More precisely, wearing a disguise around cameras could help manipulate the situation rather than just cause confusion. If they looked closely at the scene set up, they could examine the suspect's footprints and find that most of the weight was rested on his heels. That was why the front part of the footprint was now faint. When attacking someone, most of the weight would be placed on the toes. Sort of like when two wrestler bodies slammed each other in an attempt to knock each other over. The detective was curious and wondered what this new situation meant. The young genius explained that the attacker had probably also worn shoes that were too large for their feet. That would leave extra space at the front, making the toe area of the footprint faint, because their feet did not reach long enough to affect that part. Also, strangely, the side of the shoe was imprinted in certain areas and splash zones of the house, and the detective reasoned that the attacker and the victim might have struggled for a bit. However, our guy doubted that the situation was that simple, and he explained that the victim had been killed instantly. Even if a struggle did occur, if their door twisted at this angle, at minimum, their ligaments would have been strained to some degree. A fracture would have been likely. This pointed them towards yet another clue. The attacker might have worn insoles, plus, when they looked closer at the picture, they could see that the attacker walked away, stained with blood, without any form of limping. Even if their adrenaline levels were extremely high, this should not even be possible. Now that the attacker was closer to the camera, the genius told the detective to take another look at the hair strands in the video. They seemed to have slightly shifted compared to when the assailant first entered. Hair did not grow asymmetrically within a few minutes, and structurally speaking that was just impossible. And it would stay a stable length unless it had been hacked at with a knife, or it was a wig. The detective stared in awe at this evidence that he had not noticed before, his eyes wide with realization. So, the killer had deliberately worn oversized shoes, and they had stepped in the blood intentionally to make oversized prints, as well as a wig. The killer had definitely gone through great lengths to not get caught in a crime. The real culprit needed to deal with both the victim and the suspect who is currently in custody. The culprit would have had to handle both at roughly the same time, and the victim was likely considered an easy target. After all, the victim was small with a tiny physique, and he was easy to kill. However, the suspect in custody was taller and more muscular. They probably thought that he would not be as easy to eliminate. That is why the culprit avoided him. The suspect in custody was currently 184 centimeters tall, with a shoe size of 270 millimeters at the time of the arrest. When arrested, the authorities noticed that the suspect's hair was black, and he was generally confused and surprised as he was arrested. The police likely found the sudden hair color change suspicious, and the detective was shocked to realize that all of this was accurate. They had immediately accused the suspect of dyeing his hair, immediately to avoid suspicion. And they even demanded he tell them where he had dyed it. They'd yelled at him, asking him if he thought that he would not get caught, and if he thought the police were a joke. Obviously, all of that yelling got them nowhere. The detective was stunned and realized that he had gotten a bit carried away. Using all of the obvious evidence and the prints that had been left on the carpet, the genius was able to deduce that the culprit's actual shoe size was likely between 255 to 260 millimeters. The culprit likely had a personal collection with the victim and a strong reason to frame the suspect. Now they had a lead to follow, and they had to determine the reason the culprit probably felt the need to eliminate both at once. The motive would help them narrow down why the crime had occurred, and why the culprit felt the need to disguise themselves and frame one while killing the other. Sometimes a crime was committed because of money. It could also be committed because of revenge, or perhaps a woman. There were many options. The genius's conclusion was that the culprit was highly skilled sashimi knives. They also likely suffered from chronic eczema, erasing their fingerprint patterns. Also, they probably had at least a college degree, considering all of the lengths that they went through to disguise themselves. The youth was seriously a genius to come to that conclusion. This was because criminals of lower education levels tended to relate with impulsive crimes, and they didn't think about what they were doing before, they just reacted and ended up with the body in their hands. The higher the education level, the more systematic and premeditated the crime, which pointed towards all the evidence they had collected so far. The detective thought about it for a while. Then he called Gikiol, asking his partner if he had found anything. The partner had gotten back the results from testing the hair strand that they found, but it was not human hair. It was in fact synthetic, and that matched up perfectly with the genius guess. The detective was surprised, and the genius went on. The victim lived in a studio apartment and the suspect stayed at a motel, meaning neither of them had a great financial situation. The real culprit's shoe size was submitted to the detective. Considering the real culprit's shoe size, statistically speaking, that would put their height between 166 and 170 centimeters. Likely, the culprit would be in their 30s. Now that the detective thought about it, he had seen a man that sort of fit that description. The man had been vaguely questioned about the incident, and he just mumbled that it had been a while since he had seen both the victim and the suspect. It was a man who worked at a sushi restaurant who was really suspicious. It was very likely that that guy was the culprit, and the detective called for his partner to catch that guy quickly. Well, with that case resolved, it was once again another normal day in the quiet neighborhood, and the young boy found himself dropped right back at school. The detective had showered him with praises and love, almost too much love, and the boy turned him down kindly. However, Woojin did thank him for the 100,000 won. That was appreciated. Then, it was time to wonder about the motive. It turned out that the culprit borrowed money from both victims, and then he eliminated them because they were spreading rumors about him not paying it back, but those rumors were true. At any rate, the culprit had been caught, so the detective thanked the young genius and told him to keep working hard at his studies. The genius also thanked the detective and told him to take care. Suddenly, someone called out. The young man that called out seemed to be a fellow classmate that was really happy to see him. The classmate smiled, and Woojin noticed that this stranger was about 178 centimeters in height, with a short haircut. One eyebrow was slightly thicker than the other, and he had slightly tanned skin, as well as a slim but well-built physique and a gray hoodie. Woojin noted all this down just in case he needed it later. He recognized this boy as one of the members of the freshman group chat. His name was Kim Man-soo, and he was 20 years old. Judging by his wrinkles, he did look like he was in his late 20s. They were the same age. The boy smiled at the genius, saying that he was amazing back in class, and it had felt like he was watching a professional lecture. It turned out that way more people saw him that way, so the genius wanted to be a bit more careful since he was trying to be normal. Then the classmate asked if he was joining the stock trading competition. A lot of students from their department were participating. Since a lot of students were doing it, that sounded pretty normal to Woojin, so he decided to join too. If he didn't, then that would make him stand out. He had no idea that he was about to make things even worse. Then he wondered how to enter this competition in the most normal way. If he was going to make the decision to join, he wondered how to approach it after all. If he was a bit too exceptional in one, that would make him stand out. The antlion's larvae, also known as doodle bugs, was a perfect example of the situation he was in. The antlion preyed on ants, sucking out their fluids and discarding the bodies, often leaving their poor victim for dead. This behavior was not limited to just insects either. Going by the data that the boy had, lots of people studied the charts, trying to figure out the right time to buy or sell their stocks. Some people would hurry to buy, while others prayed desperately to the Lord and Buddha for a win. If stocks were to suddenly plummet and drop, then the people investing would scream in agony or punch their screens in rage. They were like the ants that the antlion preyed on. Sometimes they would even feel pushed to taking their lives and have to be escorted to a safe place by the security. Even in the stock market, people called ants had their money drained, their bodies lying empty before the fantlions that preyed on them. If most normal people were ants, then considering the situation reasonably, Woojin thought that he should be one too. However, if he lost money, his mother, father and Bomi would be sad, and that was the last thing that he wanted. So, instead of getting drained, Woojin somehow decided that he would be the one doing the draining. He raised his chosen straw high into the air with a determined look on his face. Just like sucking honey, he would plunge his straw into the good stuff and self-rationalize, since that was just part of being normal. After all, self-rationalization was part of being normal. Kim Man-soo asked about the 10 morning class, and the genius agreed. It seemed that they would be attending that lecture together. They both headed into the big brown building and walked down the long hallways. As they had all joined the stock market, some of their classmates were checking out their wins, and they noticed that they were already 3% up in profits. This was amazing to some of the classmates, and Woojin was seated next to his new friend. One of the other classmates groaned about how he was down by 7%. They say not to put all the eggs in one basket, and some of the classmates laughed about their business strategies. The genius reasoned that he should join the stock game too. He had an afternoon class tomorrow, so he would have to start in the morning. The teacher came in once again that day, waving at the students and stepping onto the podium. The professor smiled and asked if this was their third lecture already. Then, it was time to begin the lecture. They began work on the classes together, and the professor taught while the students paid attention. It was a good and interactive class about talent acquisition and market share and brand image. The professor taught with confidence about all the things that they needed to know, communicating clearly and confidently. The lecture was pretty interesting, but it was also stuff that the boy had already heard and read so many times that he started feeling drowsy. He was a genius, but he was still human, and the professor was just talking about the competitive advantage in the market when he noticed the genius was drowsy. Poor Woojin had finally given in to the needs of his body, and he'd nodded off to sleep in the middle of class. Just last class, the professor recalled when he'd called for any questions, and the boy had been very energetic and engaging when he asked his questions. The professor had also asked if anyone was struggling to understand anything, and the young boy had instantly raised his hand, eager to participate. Then Woojin had ended up somehow explaining the lecture instead of the professor, talking about the scientific approach of management studies, mathematical statistics, and corporate performance that could result in losses. It seemed that today, the boy had finally used up all of his energy and was now sleeping in class. In truth, the professor did not mind at all. He preferred it if the genius was asleep, since talking to him often turned the lecture into a form of debate. In truth, the young genius was not sleeping at all. Instead, the boy was resting, thinking that he needed to put in a lot more effort if he was going to be convincing as a normal student. Sleeping in class was a rather normal thing to do, and he wanted to experience it at least once. He'd seen dramas where some kid would sleep in class and the professor would wake him up. As expected, sleeping during a lecture was not easy, but he was willing to make all the necessary sacrifices to be normal. Well, the end of the class had finally come to an end, and the professor was going to give them all an assignment. Hearing this, Woojin's ears immediately perked up and he became alert, awaking like a zombie. His hands shot high into the air and he asked eagerly about the kind of assignment they would be getting. The boy had always wanted to do an assignment and he was absolutely thrilled. As one can imagine, the professor was not exactly thrilled that Woojin was now conscious in his class again. However, he passed the assignment anyway so that they would all read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and understand it. They were also to discuss the perfect competition market and the law of diminishing marginal utility. Within that process, they were to also analyze ethical management and discuss the role of a business manager. They were to form groups of 4 and thus submit their team list. Then Woojin raised his hand once again with so much energy, asking if scholars should use diamonds and air to explain the paradox value. The poor professor was feeling very overwhelmed as Woojin added that in modern times, they could approach the law of diminishing marginal utility differently, and then he asked if they could reinterpret it with a new understanding. Meanwhile, all of this information was news to the other students, and they wondered who on earth had used diamonds and air as examples. At this point, it wasn't even a question anymore. It was just a full-on debate. The other classmates were rather used to this by now, and they wondered what their genius was even saying. Then, he decided to explain his using mukbang, which was eating broadcast, for those who ate excessively, asking if the law of diminishing marginal utility applied to them. See, they would eat a lot, but they seemed to still enjoy the food. Even if they assumed that they were force-feeding themselves, they appeared to derive satisfaction from it. The giant ramen challenge, for instance, was the most extreme example yet. and it had over 1 million views. Since these people earned revenue through reviews, the boy wondered if this could be considered an exception to the law of diminishing marginal utility due to addiction. The professor nervously said that this was possible, but he was really going through it. Gambling and gaming addiction were also considered exceptions, so it could be seen that way. Then the genius said that calling it an addiction-based exception made him feel like he lacked the knowledge to fully understand it. The feeling of fullness was not just about having a full stomach, but about hormones, specifically leptin, in the role in making a person feel full. Now the other classmates wondered what on earth was leptin, and how hormones made it into the conversation. Other classmates wondered if being full was not just about eating a lot, and what kind of class they actually signed up for. The genius went on and said that if the secretion of leptin was low, it could lead to obesity. The professor was really going through it, and the boy babbled on about how the opposite hormone ghrelin existed, and it stimulated the brain more intensely to maintain addiction, so the neural response was generally stronger. The genius went on babbling about all the things that he knew, and the professor wondered how he was supposed to know all this in the first place. However, judging from his tone and eyes, he knew that the boy was genuinely curious. He kind of felt bad to let him down. The boy was asking a real question. He wasn't doing this just to make him look bad. He really wanted to know. The boy even wanted to talk more about the factors influencing addiction. Finally, the professor could not take it anymore, and he had to point out that he had run out of time. Oh no, he had to leave class, so that was it for today. He told the class to form their groups to submit their names that he hurriedly escaped, leaving Woojin deal with his classmates. Of course, naturally all the other boys and girls in class wanted to be in the same group as the genius. They begged him to let them join their group. Another said he called dibs first, and they were trying to form a line just to decide who would get to join his group. The genius was surprised, and the professor wondered what would happen if he got the chance to bring that exceptional boy to the lab. No, he changed his mind. He'd probably just get a headache spending any more time with that boy. He'd be more trouble than help anyway. The day passed on, and it was a wonderful, lovely evening in the boy's neighborhood. The genius had finally decided to join the stock competition, and he bought some. His buy order had been executed. Tonight was just time to wait and study the market prices. He looked at the statistics carefully, noticing which numbers went up and which numbers went down. He felt that he should feel happy, but he felt nothing. As expected, being normal was really hard to achieve. Suddenly, the stocks began to drop and his eyes widened. Well, it was nothing. He tried to ignore it, but it just kept going down, lower and lower, horrifying the genius. His eyes widened and he kept trying to tell himself that it was nothing, it was really just a simulation. He wasn't really losing anything. Then the genius wondered how his subconscious self would react if he woke up to this. He wondered how his subconscious would handle them losing so much money in a stock game like this. Everything that he had seen and heard from his loving parents and wonderful friends, they were wonderful and kind and caring. This loving home that he had found was not a place where that monster could grow. It was a place where people looked out for him. He had new experiences with friendly people. This monster knew everything that he unconsciously ignored, and it was still living inside of him. Maybe it was not a bad idea to observe himself sometimes, so he decided to pull it forth after a long time of pushing it away. Deep down inside of the genius, the monster grinned wickedly. Baring its fangs, the beast grinned with joy, or had finally been given control after being ignored for so long. A hand swept through his hair, already looking different as he smiled darkly, peeking into the mirror. The beast acknowledged his new home, and it had been a while since he'd gotten to see what they looked like in the mirror. He had to admit that he was quite handsome. He already looked like a different person, almost demonic with shining red eyes. The monster could totally become a celebrity just for fun with the adorable face that he had. He took off his shirt, showing off his scars, because it seemed he liked to do that for some reason, and reasoned that being a model would be a bad idea. After all, his wounded body would always get in the way of him becoming a celebrity. Perhaps acting just was not for him. So he sat by the computer, shirtless for some reason, and checked out the stock market and the comments coming in. There was lots and lots of information, and he processed it, taking the mouse so he could scroll and observe. Then he noticed something that he just had to do. He was definitely going to interfere with the stock market. He remembered the days that they had spent locked in that closet, laughing like a madman, surrounded by books. When they had been locked away, the monster had been given control over this body. He could do whatever it was that he wanted, while the real genius hid in the background. Now Woojin was gradually taking over and diminishing his control. The beast wasn't very fond of that, because if this continued, he might disappear completely. It was like the genius didn't need him anymore, so while he was around, he was going to correct that. That was why he needed to show Woojin his worth. So the inner beast looked at the stock market and noticed some of the big investors moving in. That was perfect. He could see signs of accumulation. Woojin's simulation was pointless. After all, there was no need for them to act like children. There was no practice in real life, only reality. The buy order had been executed and he moved in. He bought and he bought and he bought. Oh goodness, he was just gambling their money away. The demon was reckless in his stock market, but he also seemed to know what he was doing. Suddenly, stocks began to rise, pulling up from the ground like a miracle. The beast grinned wickedly, and he was determined to show Woojin that money was not something that was earned. It was something others made for him, spoken like a true capitalist. Yes, the monster could see clearly that the big investors were now moving in, and signs of accumulation were visible. It was time for them to execute the buy order. The youth activated multiple buy orders at once, betting big and large to prove his usefulness, sitting proud with the multiple scars on his body and back. The beast was going to teach Woojin that money was something that others earned for you. In other words, the boy stood like the manager of a business meeting. Unless a person wanted to print money by themselves, they had to always provide some kind of value to receive it. Whether they were an employee or a CEO, a company's chief executive office must always generate revenue in order to pay employees. Making revenue included going out on business meetings and boosting the ego of their partners. In order to generate that revenue, they must relentlessly pursue business opportunities. They had to make all sorts of connection, bowing down to those who would pay for their services or contribute greatly to their business. They would run around all day long, ensuring that their perfect customers stayed happy all year round, even when they were exhausted. A street light would pop on late in the night, shining over the exhausted execute. A company owner hired employees to make money. Those employees would encourage buyers to test out cars in order to sell it to them. The more money that these employees made, the more money would continuously flow in and out in a repeating cycle. Then, the employees could be commended for their good work and a small party could be hosted for those that did well. In order to avoid big risks, it was best to choose a stable life. However, the life of a chief executive was deadly, like dangling in a rope. As a person climbed up, there would be many willing to drag him down. If a person sought out wealth, they must also accept the risk of falling. However, even without running a business, a person still had workers making money for them. Everyone had them. That was money. People would go into the store and pay for goods and services. Money itself was an employee in a way. Money allowed people to enjoy hobbies, and it triggered endorphins and serotonin, bringing happiness while also reducing stress levels around the world. Money regulated motivation as well as activity and reward responses. Money improved both a person's physical and mental well-being. In this way, money was much like a personal massage therapist that would take care of a person's inner state, and people were always all too happy to receive that message. It was just that most people did not consciously realize it. After enjoying hobbies and self-care, the remaining money could then be put to work like an employee. A gold mine was discovered, so an employer could instruct money to go dig some gold. Thus, the money would march. Each time a person decided where to put their money, they were basically deciding where to send their employee. Some people were hesitant about sending their money to dig in a gold mine that was crypto investment. However, a more strategic person could also sell pickaxes in front of the gold mine, rather than wasting time digging for gold. People would go in, sending their money to dig for profit, not being sure if there would be gold or not. One of the diggers swung too much and the axe could not hold up. So, it was obviously time to go back and buy another. It just so happened that there was someone selling axes at the entrance. A true businessman knew how to take advantage of a demand and supply opportunity. All those diggers who searched for gold would eventually come to the person selling pickaxes, hoping that in their continuous digging they will find a reward. If the businessman sold each pickaxe for 10,000 won, then he'd make a lot of money even if he sold a few pickaxes per day. Selling pickaxes was clearly much more profitable than mining for gold. Then, it was a possibility to expand their operation. They could sell even more. However, it would be greedy. Sometimes it was best to just take the profit and leave. When investing in business, it was always important to make the right decisions with money. It was also important to know when to move on to the next opportunity. Money was an employee, and what mattered in the end would always be where and how these employees were sent. Right now, he had invested in Trinity Corporation, a company that once developed its own cosmetics. Their stock was stable until the CEO changed 2 years ago. Since then, their stock plummeted and stagnated. Signs of strategic accumulation were also visible. The market cap was 80 billion won, and that was a lot of money. If a major investor held enough capital, manipulation became possible. Trinity Corp monthly report and many other strikes came flooding in since yesterday and today. It seemed the Trinity CEO was found to be a university classmate of Rep. IM Sex. Foreign investors were now showing keen interests in Trinity Corp. If the youth did not buy at that point, he would be a fool. Now, all that was left was the grand reveal. just like this moment when the stocks had suddenly come together and were now all shooting up like a fired arrow soaring high. A domestic company was collaborating on the world's first drug development. International processors were involved in the project. People suspected that it could be a cure for baldness, and they wondered if that could really be trusted. However, no one cared because the price was going up and the national pride was surging. The people could not resist a good short-term trade. They hurried to buy and sell as much as possible, trying to make as much profit as they could from this sudden rise. Human beings are not usually rational, and they all clamored together, moving like marching insects. They followed trends and herd mentality rather than making independent decisions. The people looked at amazing hot places to go and immediately wanted to go to there. Or they saw something that looked huge and they wanted to try it out. They would check out stuff that was trending and immediately want to partake in it. It didn't matter if the trending thing was food, clothes, or just something that they casually liked. Everything was going so he could not be the only one missing out. The reservation was confirmed and thus someone's business would boost. Trend mentality really helped to pull people into doing the same thing and boosting a particular business or activity, as many people would hop on the same bandwagon together. There were so many people all gathering together and doing the same thing. When people moved like that, stocks were sure to suddenly plummet because all of that demand moved in the same downward direction. Then people would agree to panic, wondering if they were going the right way. They would scare and ask what to do now that they've found themselves in a difficult position. All of them, now turning to jump ship as soon as things started to look bad. They would panic, blaming each other and saying that they would all surely die at this rate. They kept falling and falling, and the prices were looking darn bleak to anyone who saw them. All of this despair fell upon the beast inside Woojin, bathing him like tears from a waterfall. It was like he was energized just listening to their panic and despair. The boy smiled. As everyone started to jump ship, he refused to sell. The boy laughed, wondering if the stockholders thought that they were fools. People fell and drowned in the waves of the stock market, but he sat still and steady on his rock, looking down on the people as they got swept away. People were hurrying to sell, looking for the first way out, struggling to escape. However, Woojin was determined to do no such thing. As people struggled to escape, he would step on those people, climbing on their misery and despair. As fast as the beast was concerned, these people would be his stepping stones to greatness. All of that would be so much more credible if he bothered wearing any clothes. At any rate, the boy marched forward, a very satisfied smile on his face as he marched his way to greatness. The stocks rose and plummeted like waves of the sea, rising and falling at the command of a force that they could not perceive. When the stocks rose and fell, blue and red lines moved up and down, dictating the fate of those who'd bet their money on success. Even in this unsteady tempest, the youth did not wager, and he marched forward instead. His gaze was fixed on the prize that he aimed to achieve, and he smiled wickedly with joy. This whole situation was rather boring to him. Yes, it was nothing but amusing. The monster smiled as he had finally located exactly what he was searching for. It was Estero's large red arrow, trembling as it prepared to rise. He'd always known that thing would be there, and he smirked, asking how the arrow was doing. The red arrow looked down on the youth, rising high, so high that it flew even past the clouds. This was the fruits of their labor, the benefit that so many others had thrown away. This arrow that could soar high behind anything they could see was all that he had been aiming for in this game that they played. Now the beast had called checkmate, and this was his victory. The next day, on a bright and beautiful morning in Korea, Woojin got up to head out to school as usual. His parents asked him to carry lunch since he was not eating before he left, but he assured them that he was fine. He was already quite full. It was yet another very bright and sunny day. The young Woojin admitted that it was much too late to back out now. They were better off not starting in the first place. The other students were still playing the stock game, and they asked each other how it was going for them. A few of the others had a profit of 19%, and they thought that it was pretty impressive. They even wanted him to teach them how he did it. The boy beamed and said that he would tell them to do exactly what he told them to do. They would watch the trade volume. They could also scalp the trade volume, which was a hyper-short-term trading strategy that requires investors to buy and sell securities rather quickly. They also had to check the indicators, and that was the tricky part. A few of the other students had gathered and were discussing other methods to succeed, each of them separated in different parts of class. If they knew how to observe and analyze, trading would get so much easier. The others mumbled and talked about reading The Wealth of Nations. Some of the other classmates had already finished reading that book. How interesting, the students were now getting introduced by name. It seemed they would be impotent later. Some girls were asking Woojin about his strategy techniques, and they were impressed by his skill. The boy recalled how everyone on the team had rushed to team up with him after class, some of them even promising to make snacks for him. Shin Woojin was known to be a genius, and one of the boys boosting got to his feet, wanting to go check out the conversation being had over there. He smiled and waved, looking almost cocky as he asked them how trading was going. The students looked up at the question. The mock trading competition. It seemed some of the classmates had decided not to do it. They must have lost big time and just stopped entirely. Woojin's latest friend even said that he didn't really have a knack for it, and many others agreed with him. They were not really sure how to trade stocks, and they didn't want to lose money doing it. The boy was surprised by this lack of interest and tried to encourage them to give it a shot. He thought that trading was no big deal. Woojin listened to the conversation, his eyes focused on the replies and the boy asking the questions. It was an interesting interaction. Then the boy turned to Woojin to ask if he was doing the competition, saying that he seemed like the type. Woojin priced that this boy had a crescent-shaped eye smile, and he also had a frozen expression. His smile was not reaching his eyes, and there was asymmetrical lips. It was a fake smile. A moment ago, this boy Oh Jung-hoon had sensed hesitation from his female classmate Imi Nane. It was an unconscious reaction, sort of like a natural reflex to avoid big hulking muscular men. In simple terms, men were more visually driven than women. They would be the kind to glance at a beautiful lady, amazed and impressed by how she looked. They could stare at an attractive woman all day. However, the moment she made eye contact, they would panic and look away. They were like nervous rabbits startled by a bigger prey. When a man locked eyes with someone he found attractive, it was natural for them to freeze. It was not just nervousness, it was actual fear. An evolutionary instinct that had developed over time and strengthened into an immediate reaction. This instinct had been there since the time of warriors, when defeated men cowered in fear against stronger opponents. A long time ago, powerful men would always have the most attractive women. Those women would always stay by their side, while the weaker men trembled before them. Messing with one of those women meant risking death, or getting kicked out of the group. That fear was generally built into the DNA of human beings now, and greatly explained why it was in Jung-hoon's instinct to cower at a time like this. That kind of instinct was automatically triggered. So, the boy had turned his attention to Woojin and now asked how it was going and if he was losing any money. Oh, Jung-hoon's fake smile as he asked that question, with a pretty stiff body language. The genius knew that the boy had just been boasting about his gains a few seconds before coming over to their table. The boy clearly loved to show off. That was why he'd come to the class genius. That poor child had definitely come to the wrong place. It was like a man who held a knife in their hand and was showing off how cool he was to the girls so that they would appreciate and love him. The boy was likely trying to impress Imi, and he was going to make Woojin his bruised and bloody target so that he could step on him and show off some more. Well, the kind genius finally decided to give the boy what he wanted, and he admitted that he messed up, much to the surprise of the class. Now Jung-hoon was excited and asked more details about it. He asked if the boy's profits were not as high as expected. However, when it came to Woojin, it was always the reverse problem. The boy mumbled that he was supposed to do mock trading, but he had accidentally used real cash and let the game get the better of him. The other boy was surprised to hear this, and then he started to laugh. Oh, this was going to end ugly. Jung-hoon laughed at Woojin for actually betting real money on a dangerous stock game. The boy loudly asked how the genius had possibly messed up like that. He even went as far as asking the boy how much he lost, because his stomach was already hurting from laughing so much. Well, the genius let the show-off have his laugh. He waited for the boy to calm down a nice tad, and then he spoke. To the genius, lying was not normal behavior, even though it totally was normal and people lied all the time. Perhaps Woojin had a virus in him that also made him want to show off, and he admitted that he had made a 30% profit. A 30% was absolute shocking to the laughing show-off, and his laughter dried up almost immediately. The other classmates were shocked, and they all leaned forward to see. They were amazed that the boy had even come with proof. The genius was just showing off at this point. The girls were super impressed, leaving the show-off in the dirt. The girls could not believe that the genius had actually made money by accident, and they gushed and cooed at him, calling him a trading genius. The boy's eyes widened and the genius blinked. It seemed that he had done something quite abnormal after all. Shin Woojin was a dude who wore simple clothing and nothing flashy. His eyes were huge and he wore an old phone with no watch and long fingers. His shoes were clearly under 50,000 won, but a maxed out daily trading limit was insane. The boy had made so much money accidentally on his first try. The show-off could not believe how he had been able to pull off those gains, and they wondered what stock he had bought. Then, the genius glanced to the side, smirking internal as he could see the other boy's downfall. The show-off was now looking for something in the genius, like a weakness that he could exploit. So the show-off was that kind of person who needed to be better than other people to feel relevant. How sad. Jung-hoon rushed forward, asking Woojin what stock that he had bought, even grabbing his phone so that he could see. The phone went flying into the air and the genius gasped. The show-off also gasped as the phone came plummeting down. In the short instance that her phone was airborne, flying over their heads, they could instantly calculate the device's height, weight, spec, and the drop speed as well as the angle that it would fall in. The stair material that it would land on was also taken into consideration, and they had to calculate all variables added together. There was no need to calculate anything more, because the phone was sure to break if it hit the floor. Woojin's eyes widened in horror as he realized he had to catch his precious phone that had been given to him by his family. The boy moved instantly, racing forward like his life depended on it as he ducked to reach the phone on time. Instantly, the boy caught the device before it could shatter on the stairs. The girls were amazed and clapped that he had been able to catch it. Jung-hoon was speechless. Not only had he failed in showing off or proving that he was better than the genius, he'd also messed up and accidentally dropped his phone. It was a huge ego shatter. That reflex was a nice catch and the other students were very impressed by it. Instead of apologizing and showing the slightest remorse, that horrid show-off instead told the genius to watch out next time, that abominable jerk. The genius sighed in relief and Jung-hoon paused in confusion. Woojin groaned again and the show-off gasped when he saw the markings on the genius' lower back. That's right, the boy was actually covered in scars from head to toe and he asked the boy about the scars on his back. Naturally, the genius victim was rather sensitive about the scars that he had gotten in captivity. It was a bit of a weakness that the show-off could now exploit, if he was that petty and pathetic. Jung-hoon could have let the matter drop but he pushed, asking again about the scars that he had seen. The girls listened curiously and that wicked jerk actually had a smile on his face as he asked about those scars. Indeed, that rubbish boy was planning on exploiting that weakness, and he asked the genius if he was in some kind of gang. The boy really capitalized on this weakness, going as far as saying that if the boy went to a bathhouse, then even the gangsters would avoid him. He had only seen a few scars on his lower back and he was going on and on about it. Jung-hoon was a terrible person and he kept on saying that if someone picked a fight, then they would run as soon as they saw the boy's scars. Funny that he said that because he was definitely picking a fight right then. The wicked boy even had the audacity to hike that they better treat Woojin nicely, or he'd jump them. Now the girls had not seen the scars and they wondered if the markings were really all that bad for the show-off to be saying so much about it. One of the girls had seen it, and she admitted that it looked like quite a serious injury. The genius instantly knew, of course, that the show-off was just trying to exploit his weakness. The show-off even continued to say that they should be prepared to face consequences if they slacked off on any assignment. At this point, it was bullying and the beast inside the usually reserved boy began to stir. The creature wondered if his moment had finally come. Actually, this was a very important moment for Woojin, and he'd watched enough dramas to determine that bullying was in fact a normal thing that happened in school. He had seen some of those over-the-top dramas of kids getting bullied. He knew about how people would insult or belittle others, and how even girls would tease and point, mocking a girl for having a big boyfriend, or mocking a guy for being slightly chubby. People got a superiority complex when they demeaned other people. This would trigger the brain's reward system, thus releasing dopamine. They would gang together, teasing and mocking a person, basically kicking them when they were already down, even making fun of them if they dared showed emotion that was valid for the way they were being treated. This amount of bullying gave them a temporary boost of confidence. Insulting others was not just an emotional act, and they would tease and ridicule and belittle, because it was a behavior tied to biological pleasure. Oh, Jung-hoon, for instance, with his high and mighty air, clearly loved to show off. He wanted to be better than people. He wore designer shoes and watches, just so that he could seem better than people all the time. Thus, a moment like this was clearly the kind of thing that helped him flourish. He teased the poor victim, laughing and asking if he had fought off 17 guys at once. Then the boy even joked, asking if the genius was the 1 or the 17, or if he was just number 17. This awful excuse for a human being was laughing at someone else's trauma. People like him clearly thrived on putting others down. He laughed and mocked and pointed, making fun of the poor boy. Today, this show-off had latched on to Jung-hoon, and he wanted to make fun of him as much as possible. Now the boy would not stop. The boy was like the kind to get a gang and kick people down. If this show-off had his way, he would be the kind to wait after school and mess with a person who he thought was weaker and less than him. The minority always bullied the minority. That was how things had always been since the beginning of time. Now, the person that the show-off wanted to kick down was the genius. The victim was always the minority. That was why the ones behind bullied were not considered normal. If that was the case, then Woojin was not interested in being Woojin's little victim. He wanted to live a perfectly normal life, and he needed to side with the majority. So, the boy stood up, ready to mentally face his bully. Before they stayed the project, the boy smiled and suggested that they should all grab some drinks. It was on him, since he'd made some profit. In a smooth sentence, he'd not only won the admiration of the class, but he'd also reminded everyone that he was the money-making genius in the room. The girls and the other boy were immediately interested, rushing into the light that the genius had provided, leaving the sick and twisted bully in the dark. Luring Emi now into his space was easy. This meant that he had claimed the attention of the girl that Jung-hoon had been going for. Then, the boy turned, a much better person than the sick bully, and he invited Jung-hoon to come with them. He also added that he just got lucky this time to cement his place as a normal member of society. Spewing more normalcy talk, the boy said that he actually wanted to learn a bit more about trading, providing an avenue for the bully to perhaps get closer to the girl that he admired in a more reasonable way. He also confirmed that the bully was rather good at stocks. The genius was sure that if he boosted the man's ego, then it was easy to get the bully to fall in line and into his honey trap. Jung-hoon really was a problematic guy, but the smallest bit of honey was able to lure him in. The bully walked into the blazing light that was the genius, and he found himself overwhelmed by its bright shine. Once that jerk was inside Woojin's zone, he would shine the light over him like how one would use a microscope to inspect an annoying bug. The bully would feel trapped and scared, and the genius could then use the opportunity to see what was inside of him. It was like the bully was not strapped to a medical table, and the nurse informed the Dr. Woojin that the patient was still conscious. Well, that didn't matter to Woojin, as he was the head of this operating room, and he'd seen all the dark and disgusting things hidden behind the bully's smile. Like it was an anatomy class, he would dissect that bully piece by piece until everyone could see what he truly was. He couldn't even feel sorry for him, considering that the rat had tried to crush him underfoot. The Dr. Woojin smirked that it did not matter if the patient was conscious, and he asked for the scalpel. Before they started the project, the genius was willing to take them out to grab drinks that night, just so that they could bond a little bit. He had made some money, so he would pay for the drinks. Using this method, he was able to lure the classmates towards him. Now that they were all on his side, leaving the bully in the dust. Then, to make this even better, he invited the bully to join them, and said that he just got lucky with his profits, adding that he wanted to learn more about stocks. Now this interested the bully, especially because the genius went ahead and complimented his skill with stocks. Now the bully had something to latch onto, and he said that he would go with them. So, the genius did take them out into the streets. There was laughter and people's shops were open. There were many lights and many people and many available shops for them to stop at. Many shops were inviting them in too. While the rest of them got settled, Woojin took a call from someone nearby who wanted to stop by later. This person wanted to meet the friends that he had made. The genius agreed to ask his friends for permission, and then he headed inside the shop. The genius checked out the vibes just to make sure everything was really cozy. As usual, the bully was showing off and saying that everything was pretty popular. Unfortunately, Mansu could not come to join them. Apparently, he had to go help his cousin. They hoped that he was at least getting paid for that extra help. Then genius showed up and asked if they had already ordered. They had each gotten one appetizer per person, and if there were any leftovers, they would pack them up, though they were sure that there would not be any leftovers. Then the bully spoke up, asking the genius about how he had been dozing off in class a lot lately. Jung-hoon asked if Woojin was sleeping because he had been losing stocks. The waiter came over with everything that they had ordered, and the genius was surprised because it was a lot. Then the bully wanted to talk all about how the boy had probably been up all night, checking stocks and news. The bully laughed, mocking the boy and saying that of course that happened to everyone. While the genius did not care about talking about stocks, he just wanted to eat. Naturally, the bullet didn't take kindly to being ignored, so the genius finally spoke to him. Woojin admitted that he had indeed bought stocks by accident with real money. Then the big jerk started insisting that the boy should sell his stocks quickly, because that kind of stock was risky. In fact, Jung-hoon said that the stocks looked manipulated to him. He was really just looking for how to cause the genius's downfall. The bully added that beginners usually did not make a lot of money on those, and even asked how the genius ended up picking that one. Woojin then confessed that he was looking at 19 different indices, and he checked commodities like gold, silver, copper, and WTI oil. He had also watched foreign exchange rates by country. Then he came across this one in some news articles and rumors. This surprised the bully, and he was shocked that the boy had based his choice on that. Once again, the genius reiterated that it was just an accident and he just got lucky. Even if it was a mistake, 30% profit was pretty huge, and the girls were impressed. They thought it was incredible. They had never even ordered this much food before, and they were pleased. Now, of course, the bully was feeling intimidated and frustrated because he couldn't somehow make the genius frustrated at his feet. Still, that jerk was not the kind to give up so easily. So, he grabbed the bottle saying that it was a seriously impressive mistake, and so he was going to tell everybody to drink up. He was even going to pour out a drink for the genius and the others. The genius noticed the bully was putting his hand on his waist to make himself look bigger, like a cobra, puffing up his body. This guy was really bad news. Instinctively, he was trying to make himself look more dominant. In other words, the bully was feeling threatened. Well, the girls said that it was even more amazing because the boy had made so much money from a mistake. Clearly, the bully did not like that the girl that he was interested in was praising the genius. His body language was offensive and he was addicted to showing off, so naturally he was not going to back down. He wasn't even left-handed, and yet he was going to pour the drink with his left hand. Bro was going above and beyond just to stay bragging. The bully said that if he made a few more mistakes and maybe he could buy a watch just like that he was already wearing. Already hung, June had shifted the conversation towards himself, trying to make himself the center of attention. He asked everybody to toast and to raise their glasses, and they all raised their glasses to cheer. The first drink was going to be a shot. The girls were excited that they were going to finally drink for the first time since they'd always wanted to try it. They all cheered in joy. After the toast, the genius took a sip of the alcohol and his eyes widened. This was apparently his first time trying alcohol, and this was the worst company to have it with. The people around him were talking all about how it tasted so good. Meanwhile, Woojin absolutely hated the taste. Alcohol was shit. It was not even slightly sweet. It is bitter and it is awful. Poor Woojin could not understand it, because people were always saying that alcohol tasted amazing when you were an adult. He wondered if he was just a child in a grown body because this tasted like nonsense. Still, the boy tried to keep it down so as not to ruin everyone's fun, but it sucked anyway. His phone started to ring. It turned out Hiram was calling him. Oh no, the rich girl was the friend who was nearby, and the one who wanted to stop by and meet the rest of Woojin's friends. The genius first asked everyone if it was fine for his friend to join them. Everyone was rather curious but welcoming, saying that he could indeed invite the girl over. Even if they said no, she was the type to show up anyway, and he could already tell that the bully was interested from the way he perked up. This was going to be bad news. At any rate, his classmates were fine with it, so Woojin called Hiram over and told her that she could come. They were all excited because it was a girl. Then the boy cut the call and they waited. The party went on. It was still a wonderful cool evening and they were talking, sharing stories about how they started out in class and how some of them couldn't even find the lecture hall at the beginning. Then the door flung open suddenly and the main character looked up. Lee Hiram had arrived, wearing her fancy and posh designer as usual. She was quite surprised as she did not know that the boy would like to eat at a place like this. He welcomed her, of course, and she introduced herself as his friend. The others were speechless when they saw her. They started introducing themselves. Imi Na said hello and complimented the other girl's dressing. Choi Gil also said hello and Lee Jaewon shared his name. The new girl had admitted that she had no idea that her genius friend liked wine since the group was drinking soju. Well, the boy explained that the bully had said this place was popular, so they'd all come around. He asked her to take a seat and the bully immediately introduced himself. He was amazed with the lady's beauty, and then he asked if she was really just friends with Woojin, basically asking if they were dating. Hiram turned her attention to this audacious boy, giving him a once-over as she looked from his clothes to his accessories. Then she said that they were indeed just friends and that it was nice to meet them. Then she took a seat. The girl was the kind that extremely disliked people who tried to present themselves in ways that didn't match their actual situation. Naturally, the rich girl was a show-off herself, so she immediately started flaunting her own designer, her hair, clothes, and fancy watch just to intimidate the boy. Now, the poor bully immediately hid his own watch. Feeling intimidated by her, the price range of the watch that the girl was wearing was beyond what ordinary people could possibly afford, so now the bully averted his gaze and wasn't interested in talking to her. Once again, Jung-hoon wanted to push the topic to ask if they were really just friends, saying that they looked great together. The bully, now that he felt threatened, felt like threatening other people, of course. Still, the genius just smiled and said that they were really just not like that, even though the bully thought that it felt suspicious. Wanting to move the conversation along, the genius turned to the other guy at the table and noted that his physique was great. Then he asked if the other boy did swimming as a hobby. The other boy was surprised and asked the genius how he knew. The genius then went ahead to ask if the bigger boy was really good at free diving, and he was great at snorkeling too. All of that was correct and the bigger boy beamed, asking the genius if he was interested too. He was even going to happily take them to swimming class and teach them all about the key of snorkeling and scuba diving. It sounded fun to everyone at the table. Sometime, when there was a chance, he was going to teach them wakeboarding too. Then the genius asked Imi Nai if she was interested in swimming, and the girl laughed that she didn't really have any hobbies. She just liked watching movies. Normally, questions were meant to gather information. Imi Na had recently watched a crime thriller, and she encouraged the others to check it out too because it was that good. The genius laughed and said that he was going to add it to his list, but she saw that he was not really going to watch it, and he laughed. Usually, when a person tweaked the conversation a little, people would find it more fun. They would want to talk about their birthdays, and they would exchange stuff about movies that they've watched, and even who was the cop in the crime thriller. They would ask for movie spoilers as well. There were all sorts of questions asked when people got together. Meanwhile, while everyone was enjoying the situation, the bully was sipping alcohol in silence, feeling left out, perhaps because he only had fun when he was oppressing people. Someone like him who thrived on attention would not stay quiet for too long. Suddenly, he wanted to talk about stocks. Bro did not care about anything else but stocks. He asked the big swimmer what stocks he had bought. The swimmer was a bit surprised by the question, but he thought about it for a minute. He couldn't remember the name of the stock that he bought. Then the bully scoffed, saying that of course the swimmer was losing money, since he didn't even remember what he invested in. To Jung Hoon, it was clear that the swimmer did not take his stock seriously. The bully even added that anyone who started something should at least focus on it and take it seriously. Or maybe they would get lucky like the genius and make a profit by accident. Now the bully was being mean for no reason and talking about how people were hoping to slip up and somehow win big. Now, alcohol was the kind that usually inhibited the neocortex, which controlled rational thinking and judgment. The bully was muttering about how just because it worked out once doesn't mean that it just keep working out. He scoffed, saying that the genius was a fool for buying drinks over that. In the situation that the bully was in now, he was in the state that would make the limbic system and brain stem relatively stronger. In other words, emotion, impulse, and survival instinct were all acting at the same time. This would weaken rationality and heighten emotional instinct in behavior. It was like a person putting on a mask. Everyone who was still sober had their mask still on. However, Hung Jones' mask had fallen down. Everyone reacted differently when drinking. Now the bully was focused on the bracelet that the swimmer wore. The swimmer explained that it was called Hakuna Matata, and he had heard it said that wearing it would bring good luck. Alcohol did not change people. In truth, it just revealed who they really were. Now, the bully was teasing. He laughed at the swimmer for thinking that some cheap bracelet was going to bring him luck. Then, he said that luck and opportunity came to those who chased them. If wearing a bracelet was all it took for luck to come their way, then that was clearly nonsense. Everybody was still wearing their mask of sobriety. Only the bully had been unmasked as a jerk. He had probably always been like this. He thought making fun of people made him look cool. However, the bully had no idea what he just walked into. He was busy mocking people shamelessly, and the rich girl was listening. See, Hung Jun was not the only show-off in the room. She looked up, her eyes flashing dangerously, and she then said that she wanted to know more about chasing luck. Then, the crowd gasped as the rich girl flashed her shiny hands. She showed all of the stuff that she was weeding and asked if they could see the nail polish on her fingers. It was clearly balsam flower dye. There was a saying that if you dyed your nails with it, your first love would come true. She guessed wearing that made her an idiot then. See, the rich Hiram also believed that the world revolved around her. Then she asked his name, confirming that it was Oh Jung-hoon. The girl did not care about what other people thought about her. However, since they were on the topic, she was going to ask a very important question. She pointed out all of those shabby fake branded clothes, watches, and shoes that he was wearing. She wondered if they made him actually feel better about himself. She asked if he really believed that they could prop up his fragile ego since he still liked to bring down others. Now it was the bully's turn to lash out in front of everyone. The boy stood up like a puppet being controlled in anger. Everything was unfolding exactly as the genius planned, because in truth, he was the puppeteer and everything was moving step by step just as designed. Someone was mumbling about girls. It turned out it was Bomi, and she beamed as she realized that girls were starting to talk about her brother again. Ever since seeing her brother pick her up from school, all they wanted to ask about was when she would introduce them and if they could bring food to her house. They even joked that they wanted tutoring from him. When Bomi thought about that, it sounded like the kind of thing that Woojin would actually be interested in. Her brother tutored her a bunch of times after all, and she'd appreciated it. Her brother had not experienced many things due to the restrictions he'd faced for 12 years as a prisoner. He had not gone to the zoo or to the beach, and he was someone who wanted to try many things. She also hoped that no one was bullying him in school because he was such a genius. Though she didn't really need to worry about that since he was the one going around bullying other people. If that was the case, no matter who it was, Bomi refused to forgive any bully who messed with her brother. She would not let them get away with it, and she even practiced punching her pillow to get back at them. Her parents were so surprised and even asked if something was wrong. Meanwhile, her brother was out drinking with his friends and the conversation had gotten rather dangerous. The rich girl wanted to ask the cocky brat a question. She pointed out his counterfeit watches, clothes and shoes, asking if he wore them with the belief that it would prop up his vulgar pride. When someone she disliked got angry, Hiram was the kind to look down on them even more. She saw them as pathetic. The bully refused to be looked down on, but the rich girl scoffed and called him pathetic, like a toddler showing off cheap candy. The bully hated being judged, which was ironic because he'd been judging people just a few minutes ago. The bully demanded to know who this girl was and why she was busy looking down on people. The rich girl scoffed and called him childish, asking him if he found it fun to mock others. Hung Jun pointed out that he had come as a guest, and she could not call his things counterfeit when she'd just come as a guest. He wanted to keep talking nonsense, but she was tired of listening to him and slammed money on the table. Now that silenced him. To the girl, the boy had already killed the vibe from the moment that he opened his mouth. If she ruined the mood, then she would pay for it because she could afford to do that kind of thing. Basically, she was telling him to put his money where his mouth was since he was so good at trash talking. The girl stood, telling the genius that she would be leaving now, as she could not stay any longer. With that, she left all the others stunned and walked away. The bully groaned, asking why the girl had been such a jerk. The pot calling the kettle black. The genius then revealed that she was the daughter of the CEO of Shenhua Group. At this point, Woojin was just showing off himself. The others gathered were shocked that she came from such a huge company. There was shock and awe all round the table, and the genius shrugged it off like it was no big deal. Of course he did. The girls gasped in amazement that the boy knew someone like that. They thought it was pretty interesting, and that's why she seemed so elegant. Now the bully was feeling a lot of regret because he'd been rude to someone that important. Now they were all looking at him because she'd called his stuff counterfeit. Obviously a CEO's daughter would surely know what she'd been talking about. Plus, it wasn't like Jung Hoon was nice in the first place, so no one was crazy about taking his side. They had wondered why he had all that luxury but no car, and now they wondered if his stock story was a lie too. This was how the bully's identity and character was read much like an open book by everyone. The boy still didn't let go and mumbled that he was upset and that he would step out for a bit. However, he was suddenly seized by the swimmer. The swimmer told him to calm down and that they should just drink quietly. Plus, the boy was drunk and they didn't want him to do anything stupid. The bully began to struggle with the swimmer and the girls wondered why he was acting so weird. With this, the major was now on Woojin's side, and hopefully the bully would have enough shame not to try and come at him again. The bully was really yelling at someone to stop, acting like a lunatic. He was actually chasing after the rich girl, barking at her like a mad dog and saying that there was no way that she could be the CEO's daughter. The girl scoffed that it was none of his business who she was, and she didn't feel like dealing with him, at any rate. She thought that he smelled terrible and suspected that he also used counterfeit perfume. With that last jab, she stepped into her expensive car. Still, the bully didn't want to let it go, high on alcohol and anger. However, he couldn't approach the girl because he was stopped by the bodyguards who demanded who he was. The boy tried to protest and explain, but he did look pretty violent. The night melted into morning, and the fluffy clouds were in the sky again as it turned a brilliant blue. The project report was submitted, and the members of Woojin's team were impressed and amazed. They could not believe that he had researched all of this by himself. They even asked if he had written a thesis and when he had gotten the time to read all of this. The boy just explained that this was how he did things. He took the pages and scattered them all in a hurry, paper flying everywhere, and when each took to the air, he quickly scanned every word on every page, reading and digesting and learning. As soon as he'd scanned every page, the papers would fly down and he could compile everything perfectly. All of them stared at him rather hesitant, wondering what sort of crazy technique he had unlocked. Clearly the rest of them could not read like that. Well, the boy told them that they could use the huge bulky material for reference and that they could summarize and extract what they needed. The people sighed and encouraged him to take his time. Then, they would finish the day and disband so that they could attend to other things. Mansu admitted that he was already dizzy just look at all the material that they had to cover. They even made a small joke with Mina and the group laughed, easing up their spirits. Meanwhile, Woojin made his way out, going about doing stuff that he liked to do. As he walked, he came across someone walking in the hall. He noticed the person shyly come in. It looked like Jung-hoon, and he was here for the group project. The show-off admitted that was why he had come. The boy smiled and said that his group was inside as well, so the show-off could go on and get busy. The conversation that had happened the other night still sort of hung heavy over the atmosphere. Of course, Woojin did not feel the weight, but the disgraced bully sure did. He recalled the embarrassing way that he had yelled at that girl, and she had laughed that he was so childish. So, Jun struggled to clear the air, trying to ease up the awkward air from his actions, and he said that he left his laptop in the classroom. It seems the bully was much too embarrassed to face the people that had witnessed his humiliation the other night, especially when one of them was the girl that he liked. He wished them good luck and basically sped off in a bid to avoid confrontation. From now on, Jung-hoon would not be showing any addictive heating towards him, though he could join on the same for others. Ah well, as long as the genius was left alone in peace and he had restored his ordinary daily life. It was a mural response for him to resolve this issue. Someone the classmates were passing by and trying to devise what they would eat for dinner. They wanted to go somewhere close, and it was suggested that they try some black bean noodles. Black bean noodles sounded absolutely exquisite to the genius. It sounded way too delicious that he was drooling just thinking about it. Suddenly, that was exactly what he wanted to eat. He wanted to eat some of that at the police station. It was not just black bean noodles that he wanted either. He would order some sweet and sour pork as well. Of course, the boy had immediately reached out to his favorite detective and the man sighed, saying that he just needed to smoke one more cigarette before going in. His partner asked what was going on with him. The detective noticed that his partner wasn't eating enough and told him to eat something before he went around. The man had only had a cream bun and milk, and that was not healthy at all. It looked like the man's blind date hadn't gone well either. He had probably asked for a second date and got rejected. The partner then grinned as he realized his older partner was now acting like the genius, and he asked if he was trying to imitate Woojin. The detective first asked if he was wrong. The partner grinned and explained that he had not skipped breakfast and that he'd had a heart bowl of sundae guk. He grinned as the detective could now see the soup stains and the stress-induced facial muscle tension. Besides, the blind date for delayed because of that pink Kim Jong-won. The man then teased that his Hong was a heron who was trying to imitate a sparrow. He also wanted that it would split its legs trying to do that. The detective scoffed that it was the other way around. Anyway, his mood was ruined, so he was ready to go on. The partner was still teasing him for not getting anything right, but the detective was determined to ignore him. It did seem like there had been a lot of incidents in their jurisdiction lately, and the detective wondered if some kind of death god had moved in. It was absolute chaos out there. Those jerks. He was determined to find them all, tear them apart, and then lock them up. So the two detectives hopped into their black stylish car and drove off. The sky looked dark and rather cloudy that evening over the genius nice neighborhood. It seemed another concerning police case had occurred and the detectives were on the scene. They scanned around, checked out the area, while a few olive cars managed to fit through the narrow streets. The detective stepped out of his own car and flashed his ID to prove that he could be there. The man walked in proudly and looked around at the area. As the detective scanned the area, walking boldly and looking around, he greeted the chief, who was hard at work, and asked why the man was taking so many photos. The man told the detective not to even ask. Then the detective froze, horrified by the gory scene in front of him. He couldn't believe just how dark and murderous these villains were getting. The man asked if the identity had been figured out yet, and even his partner was spooked by such gore. It was a boy who was 21 years old, and his name was Park Jong-hyuk. The boy was the son who lived in this house, so he'd been killed in his own home. The detective wondered if it was some kind of grudge and asked about the parents. The photographer informed the detective that the parents were in the living room. So, the detective took off his shoes and headed inside the house, his skittish partner following behind him, apprehension on their faces. They headed inside to see two distraught adults in the room, while the police inspected and photographed the area. Addressing grieving parents was always the most difficult part of the operation. Though he wanted to comfort them, quickly gathering information to catch the culprit was the priority, though it was always possible to do both. The detective stepped forward, saying that he did not know what to say, and he understood that the situation was difficult, but he needed to ask some questions. The father was hysterical, and he screamed to the detective, telling him to hurry up and catch the person who did this quickly. Sometimes catching the perpetrator was the greatest comfort a police office could give. The mother could barely speak and looked on the verge of collapse. It was like the kindest thing they could do for her was take her to a hospital. They asked about the ambulance, and that was already on its way. They moved the mother slowly, knowing to take it easy, and they even got one more person to help make the move smoother. They had to keep their balance and to watch out for the bricks on the floor. The necessary teams had been contacted, and it was best for them to work through the night, if necessary, just to get the forensic results. If there was anything else to come up, the detective wanted to be informed of it. There was nothing significant of note yet. The people inspecting the area admitted that they had never seen such a psycho before who would manhandle a living person to such extremes. Looking at the crime, this was definitely not a first-time offender. Dismembering the body and sending it to their victim's home was very sick work. First, they would start by checking the nearby CCTV footage. The detective looked around, worrying about this case when he suddenly got a phone call. He wondered what the boy wanted to eat this time because that was often why the boy called him first. However, this was the perfect time because the detective was ready to treat the boy to anything if would solve this case. Woojin called happily that stormy evening because he had been dreaming of black bean noodles. The detective also greeted him happily because he needed a case to be solved. It was always rare for the genius to be the first to call, and the genius asked if the detective had eaten. Meanwhile, his team trudged after him, feeling defeated after reciting those heavy books that the genius had given them. The detective admitted that he had not eaten, but it looked like dinner was off for today. This was because they had yet another case to solve. The genius accurately guessed that the detective was at yet another murder scene, and the boy asked if it would be okay if he came by. That was exactly what the detective had been hoping for. Woojin had barely finished his request before the detective loudly agreed that the boy would definitely be able to help a bit. It would be great if he would come. The detective was so loud that all of the street could hear his powerful voice. It was so strong that it came out like a booming sound that created a great wind. Even his classmates wondered who on earth he was talking to. The detective was definitely sure that the genius would be helpful in this case. After all, the boy was basically their pro-profiler. Some of the other profilers on scene seemed rather offended by that. They cleared their throats, so the detective quickly apologized to them. However, the detective then asked if the boy would be fine after all. The crime scene was rather gruesome, and it could be too much for him. The body they were facing this time was dismembered. The genius said that he would be fine. If that was the case, then the detective was happy for him to come and join them. If this case went well, then they would be able to go back to that prime meat place that the genius liked so much. However, the genius had something else in mind. He didn't want to go there. The law of diminishing marginal utility might apply, so they needed to eat a variety. Even if it was delicious, if they continued to eat it too often, then they would get tired of it. The detective was very confused about that because it didn't sound like it was about eating. However, Woojin's craving today was very specific. He wanted to eat at the police station, jjajangmyeon, sweet and sour pork, fried dumplings too. The detective could not believe this request. It sounded so simple for the case that they were facing. Yet, it seemed that the genius was willing to come to the time scene just to get free jjajangmyeon and sweet and sour pork. One of the officers on ground was coming to check out the team leader, and the detective was just confirming with the boy if that little food would really enough. Since the boy was fine with it, the officer had to accept. The partner was excited to hear that the genius was coming and even asked if he should go pick him up. The detective agreed and said that he should definitely go and bring him over before the menu changed. Since this mission was going to come cheap, they should hurry up and bring him. So, the detective communicated that his partner is going to come and get Woojin. However, the genius just said that he would come over instead and they should just send him the address. It was a nice and warm day in the evening over the quiet neighborhood. The genius boy walked his way over to the restricted area, and he was able to identify the place thanks to the flashing lights. The detective met him at the stairs and waved the boy over. The detective was pretty impressed that he was able to find the place just fine, even though he was going to come and get him. However, the boy had to point out that it was not ordinary for the police to keep picking you up from school. Coming here itself was not ordinary as it is, but it was better if he just walked there. So it was time for them to go into the very gruesome crime scene. The partner even laughed. The boy looked a bit too much like a student, and the boy pointed out that he was a student. So, as a warm-up quiz, the partner asked if the boy could guess what he ate today. The boy accurately guessed it was blood sausage soup. It was just as they expected of the genius. He knew everything. The boy even pointed out that the man had tried to brush his teeth to hide the evidence. Then they managed to get upstairs and the detective met them and greeted the boy. They even called out to the detective that the boy was here. The detective was happy to see him, and he told his partner to take care of the father of the deceased. Then the boy asked where the body was. Well, the body was being moved by the National Forensic Service to be examined. So the boy asked who was the first to discover it, and if they'd taken photos. Of course, the detective had already received the photos that had been taken. The body was first discovered by the mother who was returning home after work. The perpetrator, of course, had not been identified. One of the members of the forensic team was surprised to see the young genius and act who he was. The detective said that this was the younger brother that he had told them about. The genius said hello. However, the profiler was a bit skeptical as he met this young boy, who supposedly had profiler's intuition. He wondered if it was really fine for a civilian to walk into a crime scene. The detective promised to be quick and so that they could just keep it a secret. Well, then the profiler scoffed that the boy had been brought to the scene just because he'd made a few lucky guesses a few times. The profiler told the detective not to get caught and get disciplined for doing nonsense. After he left, the detective told the young boy just to ignore it, and they would continue to try to solve the case. Anyway, the boy believed that this was natural treatment for a civilian, and since he wanted to be ordinary, this was fine. Then he asked to see the photos quickly. The detective paused again, asking if he was really fine with seeing it because it was really gruesome. It was a photo of a dismembered body. Even he had never seen something like this. Woojin assured the detective that he was fine. The detective said that if he felt sick then or strange, he should tell him immediately. The boy agreed, so the older man also said that if he should not try to endure it, if it was too much. He also said that the boy could just swipe through them if it was too much for him to see. The boy now felt like the detective was doing too much. Then he opened the pictures, and he finally saw the terrible gruesome scene. Even the genius was surprised at how horrible it was. However, he locked in pretty fast. Using the arms, the legs, as well as the cut surface, he began to identify the tool that had been used. The fastest way to identify what had been used was to exclude what had not been used. He moved away the big chopping knife. He also moved away a possible cutting device. He then considered the possibility of heavy machinery. It was possible, but the cut surface was not as clean as machine work, so that was likely not the case. It made more sense that the perpetrator likely used a saw. That would explain the gruesome bloody mess that has been left behind. Then the boy looked around for even more clues to identify what had been done. He picked up a bit of nylon and asked what it was. The detective explained that it had ohm from the body and they would have to analyze it as well. The boy looked at it and said that it looked like thread and lint. Even the detective admitted that it did look like that. People often used cotton gloves when handling meat. Then the boy looked closer. The box containing the body had been found inside. This box was clean on the outside. It turned out to be an ice box, so the body had been buried inside. Then the boy asked if the people living on the first floor, or the victim's family, usually locked their front door. This was going to be important information for the case. The detective explained that they did lock their doors, and they must have been even more shocked that it happened. This meant that the perpetrator knew the patterns of the people living here well. There was a high chance that this was someone that they knew. The perpetrator had likely climbed over the wall from the other side. One part the wall had been cleared of dust to prove that it had been brushed by something. Looking at the wall again, it was not just a hand of friction either. The person had went over belly down, so the dust distribution was large. Therefore, the perpetrator's height was likely around 170 centimeters. It was also possible that they might have less athletic ability than the average person, so they might consider an older age range, and he drew marks over the perpetrator's possible face as he tried to pinpoint what they would look like. That could likely be the case. No, it seemed very right to the boy. Then they wanted to know who was inside as he studied the layout of the building in front of him. The victim's mother was just taken to the hospital and only the father remained, so the boy now wanted to see the inside of the house. The detective was surprised that the boy wanted to go in, but the boy insisted that he had to, so they would be going inside. As they made their way in, the detective reminded the boy that he could not touch anything once he was inside. The boy understood and asked him to open it quickly. He was also to refrain from any conspicuous actions. Now, the boy wondered why the detective was acting like this today. He knew all the rules. It seemed the man had been affected by the profiler's words and did not want to get in trouble. Once they were inside, they found the detective's partner trying to comfort the father and also get some information from him. The detective asked Genius if he wanted to make a quick look around, and the genius said yes. So they kept talking to the father, asking how his health was, and just generally checking if he also needed hospital aid. While they talked, the genius looked around the living room. He noted the TV and the table. He looked at the awards that were hanging in the corner as well. It seemed that there were no family photos. That was odd. This father, seemed unable to let go of his past glory and had a high self-esteem. There was a larger refrigerator and ceramic dining table. There was also a dishwasher. This was a 2-story house, and it was clearly not for the average person because it had a lot of space. Considering that there was a lot of incongruity in the living room, it seemed that his business had failed. Then the boy walked up to the father to assess him. He asked the man if he had any grudges or conflicts, and the man immediately thought that this young boy was likely also a detective. The man said that there was nothing like that, nothing at all, as he had already said before. Now the genius identified that the man was trying to convince him with a hypnotic argument by looking him straight into the eyes, as if saying that he needed the boy to believe him. On the contrary, the man kept his tried to keep his body still by pressing his back against the sofa. This was a freeze response. The genius asked the man to please think carefully, there must be something. The man insisted that he had lived his entire life without causing a speck of harm to others, so he couldn't think of a single thing. Then the genius decided to prod him, asking if there had been anything that happened with the butcher shop. Then the father's eyes widened. The detective and his partner also looked rather confused. The man raised his head, asking what the boy had just said about a butcher shop. Now the man was leaning close to hear, to see. He now wanted to hear more and talk more. This was important. The genius once again mentioned the butcher shop, and the man before him began to tremble. The man cursed, throwing his phone to the ground as he screamed and cursed at someone. Now that was the kind of reaction they hadn't seen since got there. The detective was surprised. The man now had someone that he suspected, someone called Songbeam. The man cursed once again now, shaking with rage, wondering if that had been the guy to do something to their son. The plot thickened. The genius mentioning the man at the butcher shop rang a bell in the ears of the father of the victim. Now the plot thickened, and the genius asked who this person was, this Lee Seong-beam. The father of the victim was in distress as the genius asked if this person worked at a butcher shop. It was like playing with a box puzzle. The genius had to keep every possibility in mind while he put the pieces of the puzzle together. Now the father was hiding his face in despair. Likely the man was overwhelmed with emotions and facing reality that was much too painful for him. It was also possible that he was trying to hide what he truly felt. This was a natural defense mechanism. The father of the victim admitted that, last time, there was a guy who spread a rumor that his son had sexually assaulted his daughter. That man was a butcher. The father was enraged because the butcher who cut meat had been the one behind that nasty rumor. He was sure that his incident was likely related to him. Everything now fit together, and the man screamed. He thought they had reached an agreement concerning that issue, and that they had settled this amicably. The father screamed that they should hurry up and find that guy and arrest him immediately, jumping to his feet and even swearing to end his life. The detective hurried to calm down the father, telling him to relax. The man yelled, asked if they really expected him to calm down in this situation. The father continued to yell that they should hurry up and arrest the butcher. As the man screamed and shouted, the young genius walked out of the room, while the partner tried to calm the man down, telling him that they would take responsibility and bring him in. They managed to get the man to take a seat and told him to take a deep breath first. However, the man refused to relax and kept yelling and cursing at the butcher. Still, the genius was quiet. The detective asked the genius how he had known that the guy would run a butcher shop. He even wondered if the boy had some kind of sixth sense or something. However, Woojin said that it was too obvious. Now the detective was concerned, wondering how it was obvious, and he wanted to know because only the boy was able to understand. The boy explained that the killer was bold enough to leave a dismembered body at the victim's front door. His audacity was quite surprising. Only someone with malicious intent was able to do something like that. Being audacious meant being meticulous as well, and the killer had waited until no one was at home. The man was that confident that he would be able to get away with it. However, the man had left behind some evidence that had been discovered in the pictures and in the scene of the crime. Thread and lint that could have come from his gloves. The killer was meticulous, yet he had left evidence. Now that sounded really strange. The detective considered that perhaps the killer had overlooked the thread and lint when he was committing his crime. After all, it was normal for people to make mistakes. Criminals could appear systematic at times, but they could also show disorganized traits doing the crime. Yes, that made sense, as the man had mentioned the criminal showed the systematic side. However, they had also displayed some disorganized behavior. Overall, the criminal was a very systematic individual. He had waited until no one was at home, and he had showed up to leave the body in a very audacious place where the couple would find it. The killer knew the daily routine of the first and second floors of the house. It was highly likely that it was someone that they knew, because he knew when they would be there and when they would be out. Bases on these clues, the genius could guess that the killer was older, and they often lacked quick reflexes. On the other hand, regarding disorganized traits, if one looked closely at the cross-section of the dismembered body, it resembled the type made with a bone saw used in the butcher shop. However, the cutting surface was rougher than what one would see with those machines. The killer had likely used the saw in a way that mimicked the butcher's knife. There was now a high chance that the killer was trying to stage the scene and had not actually used the machine. Now that the genius thought about it, It was not likely that someone that meticulous would leave thread and lint behind. It didn't make sense, especially for someone who handled meat regularly like a butcher. Their job was all about spotting and removing anything foreign from meat. A person like that wouldn't make a mistake like that. In fact, it sounded more like the killer had intentionally used the butcher-style saw to cut the body, so as to deliberately frame the butcher and leave thread and lint behind. A body would decompose through several stages: fresh bloated, active decay, advanced decay, and eventually it would hit the skeletal form. The killer even used ice packs to slow the decomposition of the body, and that was likely to confuse the timeline of the death. So even though everything looked calculated, some of it was staged. This perpetrator only showed them what they wanted them to see, like the machine and the conveniently placed lint. Now that detective thought of it like that, he was concerned. It was a normal thought, so the gentle genius told the detective not to beat himself up about it. People would only see what they wanted to see and believe what they wanted to believe. That was what made them normal after all. The genius thought that must be nice. The detective wondered if he was being insulted because being able to look once and guess everything correctly sounded way better to him. The detective would rather be a genius. Unfortunately, being called a genius made the poor boy feel bad, so the detective had to hurry and retract the statement. He told the boy that he was in fact very ordinary, just like him. That made the boy feel so much better, though the detective thought this kid was really weird. Back to the case, what the genius was saying was that the real killer was someone who wanted them to think that it was the butcher. Yes, that seemed very likely. If they checked the CCTV or the black box footage, it would probably lead them straight to the butcher shop as well. This person had really wanted them to follow the trail right to the butcher like an arrow. That was exactly how the killer had planned it. This felt rather similar to the case from before with that guy had worn that wig with large shoes. Actually, this was a little different, but it did have the same suspicious vibe. So the boy decided to look a little closer at the cooler that the body was found in. Looking at the beautiful blue box with the flower patterns, they studied it for clues. It did not seem like there was anything special about it at first, because there was not a single scratch, and it looked rather brand new. The genius said the detective was right, and it was probably bought just for the crime. Then the detective asked what was wrong with that, and if there was a hidden meaning behind that. Woojin then asked how the cooler was moved after the crime had been committed. He assumed the forensic team had taken care of that, and he was right. The team had carried it between the two of them, watching the stairs and keeping their balance to make sure that the body would not be disturbed as they moved the cooler. So, Woojin then tried to imagine how the killer had gotten such a big cooler into the house. If it took two people to move a cooler that heavy with a body inside, then the question was how had one man managed it while sneaking into someone else's property? Now that the detective thought about it, the boy had a point. Likely the criminal had climbed over the wall and opened the front gate. Even so, that huge box would still have been really heavy. So how had he climbed up all of the stairs with that giant cooler by himself? Surely, it would have left at least one scratch in the walls. Even the detective agreed that this was odd. Thus, the next question was how had the killer been able to move the cooler so cleanly from the bottom of the house to the upstairs floor? Since they had guessed that the killer was likely trying to frame the butcher, then they had to guess on what kind of motive would drive someone to murder a child and set it up like this. One of the officers came over and reported to the detective that there were usually no cars parked around here. But another detective just called and said that a suspicious car showed up on the CCTV near the convenience store. A man dressed like a delivery worker had briefly got out and then disappeared. The person had worn a cap and a mask too. The genius said that it was just for show and likely the butcher's alibi was flawless as well. Now this new person was surprised to see the genius on scene, and he wondered who this was and if it was a newcomer. The detective focused the guy on tracing the car through all the CCTV immediately. They had to get to the bottom of this case. Then the detective turned to the genius boy. If it was not the butcher, then they had to find the real killer immediately. The detective wondered if he was asking the boy too much. However, the genius said that he could figure it out. Now the detective was interested and he asked who it was. It was definitely someone who did not like the butcher or someone who hated the victim. Now Woojin walked forward, leading the detective inside. The identity of the killer would likely be revealed by the grieving father of the victim. So, the boy opened the door. The detective surprised there might be someone else in the picture. They made it inside the living room while the police cars stayed downstairs to keep the peace. Inside the room, the victim's father had gotten into his feet. The partner was trying to calm him down while the genius in the detective finally made their way inside. They could not imagine what the father of the victim was going through right now and they told man to calm down. The man told them to let go of him and he was still very clearly agitated. Meanwhile, the genius identified that the father's foot was swollen. The man insisted that he needed water, and the genius also figured out that man's eyes were slightly yellow and his lips were dry. Plus, the man kept swallowing like he was thirsty. The detective's partner hurried to get the medicine or water, wondering why the father was making such a big deal out of just water. The father was reaching out to grab something, but then someone grabbed his hand and made him pause. It was the genius. The genius had grabbed the father's hand, and he noticed that the man's hands felt cold. He asked the man if he needed to pee more often lately. Man's walk was also rather steady, and his fingertips looked slightly swollen as well. It may look like simple dehydration, but it was not. These were symptoms of diabetic complications and kidney issues. Everyone was surprised the boy even knew that. Drinking water right now might actually cause the man's kidneys to get worse. The man yelled and asked who even cared about that right now, brushing the genius's hand aside. He told him to hurry up and catch the person who had killed his son. However, the genius kept going, saying that it looked like the man's business had been successful, but things had been going south recently. The man wondered if he was being mocked and yelled that plenty people failed at businesses. It was not uncommon to have problems. Plus, he even said that it was not important right now. The detective was extra worried now, and he reminded Woojin that the victim's father was going through a tough time right now, and he should speak rather gently to him or he'd get the man fired. However, the genius pointed out that the victim had a contusion on his head. It could be referred to as a laceration, and the boy had died from being hit with something blunt but sharp. Then after the boy had died, his body had been cut into pieces. It varies from person to person, but generally, if there was not a relationship-filled resentment, normally it was quite rare for someone to cause such a situation. That was why the genius had asked about the business. Woojin then asked if a man like the butcher could really have such a grudge. Even when his daughter was assaulted, the man had chosen to settle. He was the kind of father who chose peace. The genius wondered if a man like that could really murder a young boy and then leave such a gruesome scene for a person to find. It did not seem likely that a man like the butcher had that kind of hatred. Both the detective and his partner admitted mentally to themselves that they would not be able to let someone hurting their daughter slide. Most fathers would never agree to a settlement, especially when their child was involved. They would want the person behind it to be locked up immediately. That was why they had to consider every possibility. In other words, the killer likely held a very personal grudge against the man. The father was shocked, saying that he had never done anything to anyone in his life. He looked like a liar. Still, the genius told the man to think very carefully and try to remember. He had to think very hard because they did not have much time. That's it for this episode. Until next time.